Book 4, Chapter 1 of Hilda Lessways by Arnold BENNETT. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Book 4, Her Fall, Chapter 1, The Going Concern. 1. On a Saturday afternoon of the following August, Hilda was sitting at a book in the basement parlour of Cannon's boarding house in Preston Street. She heard through the open window several pairs of feet mounting wearily to the front door, and then the long remote tinkling of the bell. Within the house there was no responsive sound, but from the porch came a clearing of throats, a muttering, impatient and yet resigned, and a vague shuffling. After a long pause the bell rang again, and then the gas globe over Hilda's head vibrated for a moment to footsteps in the hall, and the front door was unlatched. She could not catch the precise question, but the reply of Louisa, the chambermaid, haughty, scornful, and negligently pitying, was quite clear. "Sorry, sir, we're full up. We've had to refuse several this very day. No, I couldn't rightly tell you where. You might try number 51 Homely, as they call it, but we're full up. Good afternoon, sir. Good afternoon, mum." The door banged arrogantly. The feet redescended to the pavement, and Hilda, throwing a careless glance at the window, saw two men and a woman pass melancholy down the hot street with their hand luggage. And although she condemned and despised the flunky-souled Louisa, who would have abased herself with sickly smiles and sweet phrases before the applicants if the house had needed custom, although in her mind she was saying curtly to the mature Louisa, "It's a good thing Mr. Cannon didn't hear you using that tone to customers, my girl," nevertheless she could not help feeling somewhat as Louisa felt. It was indubitably agreeable to hear a prosperous door closed on dusty and disappointed holiday-makers, and to realize, in her tranquil retreat, that she was part of a very thriving and successful concern. 2. George Cannon, in a light and elegant summer suit, passed slowly in front of the window, and, looking for Hilda in her accustomed place, saw her and nodded. Surprised by the unusual gesture, she moved uneasily and blushed, and as she did so she asked herself resentfully, "Why do I behave like this? I'm only his clerk, and I shall never be anything else but his clerk, and yet I do believe I'm getting worse instead of better." George Cannon skipped easily up to the porch. He had a latchkey, but before he could put it into the keyhole, Louisa had flown down the stairs and opened the door to him. She must have been on the watch from an upper floor. George Cannon would have been well served, whatever his situation in the house, for he is one of those genial bullies who are adored by the menials whom they alternately cajole and terrorize. But his situation in the house was that of a god, and like a god he was attended. He was the very creator of the house. All its life flowed from him. Without him the organism would have ceased to exist, and everybody in it was quite aware of this. He had fully learnt his business. He had learnt it in the fish market on the beach at 7 o'clock in the morning, and in the vegetable market at 8, and in the shops. He had learnt it in the kitchen and on the stairs while the servants were cleaning, and he had learnt it at the dinner-table surrounded by his customers. There was nothing that he did not know, and, except actual cooking and mending, little that he could not do. He always impressed his customers by the statement that he had slept in every room in the house in order to understand personally its qualities and defects, and he could and did in fact talk to each boarder about his room with the intimate geographical knowledge of a native. The boarders were further flattered by the mien and appearance of this practical housekeeper, who did not in the least resemble his kind, but had rather the style of a slightly doggish stockbroker. To be strolling on the King's Road in converse with George Cannon was a matter of pride to boarders male and female, and there was none with whom he could not talk fluently on any subject from cigars to ozone, according to the needs of the particular case. Nor did he ever seem to be bored by conversations. But sometimes, after benignantly speeding, for instance, one of the Watchets on her morning constitutional, he would slip down into the basement and ejaculate, "Cursed hag!" with a calm and natural earnestness which frightened Hilda, indicating as it did that he must be capable of astounding duplicities. He came now directly to the underground parlour, hat on head and ebony stick in hand. Hilda did not even look up, but self-consciously bent a little lower over her volume. Her relation to George Cannon in the successful enterprise was anomalous, and yet the habit of 10 months had in practice defined it. Neither paying board nor receiving wages, she had remained in the house apparently as Sarah Gailey's companion and moral support. She had remained because Sarah Gailey had never been in a condition to be left, and the months had passed very quickly. But her lack of occupation and her knowledge of shorthand and George Cannon's obvious need of clerical aid had made it inevitable that they should resume their former roles of principal and clerk. Hilda worked daily at letters, circularizing, advertisements, and to a less extent accounts and bills. The second finger of her right hand had nearly always an agreeable stain of ink at the base of the nail, and she often dreamed about letter filing. In this prosperous month of August she had, on the whole, less work than usual, for both circulating and advertisements were stopped. George Cannon went to the desk in the dark corner between the window and the door, where all business papers were kept, but where neither he nor she actually wrote. When his back was turned, she surreptitiously glanced at him without moving her head, and perceived that his hand was only moving idly about among the papers while he stared at the wall. She thought, half in alarm, "What is the matter now?" Then he came over to the table and hesitated by her shoulder. Still she would not look up. She could no longer decipher a single word on the page. Her being was somehow monopolized by the consciousness of his nearness. "Interesting?" he inquired. She turned her head at last, and glanced at him with a friendly smile of affirmation, fingering the leaves of the book nervously. It was Cranswick's History of Printing. One day, a fortnight earlier, while George Cannon, in company with her, was bargaining for an old London directory outside a bookseller's shop in East Street, she had seen Cranwick's History of Printing, labelled "Published at 1 guinea, our price 6 shillings and sixpence," and had opened it curiously. George Cannon, who always kept an eye on her, had said teasingly, "I suppose it's your journalistic past that makes you interested in that?" "I suppose it is," she answered. Which statement was an untruth, for the sole thought in her mind had been that Edwin Clayhanger was a printer. A strange, idle thought. She had laid the book down. The next day, however, George Cannon had brought it home, saying carelessly, "I bought that book, 5 and 6. The man seemed anxious to do business, and it's a book to have." He had not touched it since. "Page 473, he murmured, looking at the number of the page. "If you keep on at this rate, you'll soon know more about printing than young Clayhanger himself." She was thunderstruck. Never before had the name of Clayhanger been mentioned between them. Could he then penetrate her thoughts? Could he guess that in truth she was reading Cranswick solely because Edwin Clayhanger happened to be a printer? No, it was impossible. The reason of her interest in Cranswick, inexplicable even to herself, was too fantastic to be divined. And yet, was not his tone peculiar? Or was it only in her fancy that his tone was peculiar? She blushed scarlet, and her muscles grew rigid. "I say," George Cannon continued, in a tone that now was unmistakably peculiar, "I want you to come out with me. I want to show you something on the front. Can you come?" "At once," she muttered glumly and painfully. What could be the mystery behind this most singular behaviour? "Yes." "Florrie will be arriving at 5, said Hilary, after artificially coughing. "I ought to be here then, oughtn't I?" "Oh," he cried, "we shall be back long before 5." "Very well," she agreed. "I'll be ready in 3 minutes," he said, going gaily towards the door. From the door he gave her a glance. She met it, courageously exposing her troubled features, and nodded. 3. Hilda went into the bedroom behind the parlour to get her hat and gloves. A consequence of the success of the boarding-house was that she was temporarily sharing this chamber with Sarah Gailey. She had insisted on making the sacrifice, and she enjoyed the personal discomfort which it involved. When she had cautiously lay down on the narrow and lumpy truckle bed that had been insinuated against an unoccupied wall, and when she turned over restlessly in the night, and the rickety armwork creaked, and Sarah Gailey moaned, and when she searched vainly for a particular garment lost among garments that were hung pell-mell on insecure hooks at jutting corners of furniture, she was proud and glad because her own comfortable room was steadily adding 30 shillings or more per week to the gross receipts of the enterprise. The benefit was in no way hers, and yet she gloated on it, thinking pleasurably of George Cannon's great japanned cash-box, which seemed to be an exhaustless store of gold sovereigns and large silver, and of his mysterious, almost furtive, visits to the bank. Her own capital, invested by George Cannon in railway stock, was bringing in 4 times as much as she disbursed, and she gloated also on her savings. The more money she amassed, the less willing was she to spend. This nascent avarice amused her, as a new trait in her character always amuses the individual. She said to herself, "I'm getting quite a miser," with the assured reservation, "Of course I can stop being a miser whenever I feel like stopping." Sarah Gailey was lulling herself in a rocking-chair when Hilda entered, and she neither regarded Hilda nor intermitted her seesaw. Her features were drawn into a preoccupied expression of martyrdom, and in fact she constantly suffered physical torture. She had 3 genuine complaints: rheumatism, sciatica, and neuritis. They were all painful. The latest and worst was the neuritis, which had attacked her in the wrist, producing swollen joints that had to be fermented with hot water. Sarah Gailey's life had indeed latterly developed into a continual fermentation and a continual rocking. She was so taken up with the elemental business of fermenting and of keeping warm, that she had no energy left for other remedial treatments, such as distraction in the open air. She sat for ever shawled, generally with heavy mittens on her arms and wrists, and either fermenting or rocking, in the eternal twilight of the basement bedroom. She eschewed aid. She could manage for herself, and she did not encourage company, apparently preferring to be alone with fate. In her easier hours, one hand resting on another, and both hugged close to her breast, rocking to and fro with an astounding monotonous perseverance, she was like a mysterious Indian god in a subterranean temple. Above her, unseen by her, floor beyond floor, the life of the boarding-house functioned in the great holiday month of August. "I quite forgot about the make-up bed for Florrie," said Sarah Gailey plaintively as she rocked. "Would you have time to see to it? Of course you shall have to be with Louisa." "Very well," said Hilda curtly, and not quite hiding exasperation. There were 3 reasons for her exasperation. In the first place, the constant spectacle of Sarah Gailey's pain, and the effect of the pain on Sarah's character, was exasperating, to Hilda as well as to George Cannon. Both well knew that the watery-eyed, fretful spinster was a victim, utterly innocent and utterly helpless, of destiny, and that she merited nothing but patient sympathy. Yet often the strain of relationship with Sarah produced in them such a profound feeling of annoyance that they positively resented Sarah's sufferings, and, with a sad absence of logic, blamed her in her misfortune, just as though she had wilfully brought the maladies upon herself in order to vex them. Then, further, it was necessary always to minister to Sarah's illusion that Sarah was the mainstay of the house, that she attended to everything and was responsible for everything, and that without her governance the machine would come to a disastrous standstill, the fact being that she had grown feeble and superfluous. Sarah had taught all she knew to 2 highly intelligent pupils, and had survived her usefulness. She had no right place on earth. But in her morose inefficiency she had developed into an unconscious tyrant, a tyrant whose power lay in the loyalty for her subjects, and not at all in her own soul. She was indeed like a deity, immanent, brooding, and unaware of itself. Thus the question of Florrie's bed had been discussed and settled long before Sarah Gailey had even thought of it, but Hilda might not tell her so. Lastly, this very question of Flora's bed was exasperating to Hilda. Already Louisa's kennel was inadequate for Louisa, and now another couch had been crowded into it. Hilda was ashamed of the shift, but there was no alternative. Here for Hilda was the secret canker of George Cannon's brilliant success. The servants were kindly ill-treated. In the commercial triumph she lost the sense of the tragic forlornness of boarding-house existence as it had struck her on the day of her arrival. But the image of the Indian god in the basement, and of the prone forms of the servants in stifling black cupboards under the roof and under the stairs, these images embittered at intervals the instinctive and reflecting exaltation of her moods. She adjusted her small close-fitting flowered hat, dropped her parasol across the bed, and began to draw on her cotton gloves. "Where are you going, dear?" asked Sarah gaily. "Out with Mr. Cannon." "But where?" "I don't know." In spite of herself, there was a certain unnecessary defiance in Hilda's voice. "You don't know, dear?" Sarah gaily suddenly ceased rocking, and glanced at Hilda with the mournful expression of acute worry that was so terribly familiar on her features. Although it was notorious that baseless apprehensions were a part of Sarah's disease, nevertheless Hilda could never succeed in treating any given apprehension as quite baseless. And now Sarah's mere tone begot in Hilda's self-consciousness a vague alarm. She continued busy with her gloves, silent. "And on Saturday afternoon too, when everybody's abroad," Sarah gaily added gloomily, with her involuntary small movements of the head. "He asked me if I could go out with him for a minute or two at once," said Hilda, and picked up the parasol with a decisive gesture. "There's a great deal too much talk about you and George as it is," said Sarah, with an acrid firmness. "Talk about me and—" Hilda cried, absolutely astounded. She had no feeling of guilt, but she knew that she was looking guilty, and this knowledge induced in her the actual sensations of a criminal. "I'm sure I don't want—" Sarah gaily began, and was interrupted by a quiet tap at the door. George Cannon entered. "Ready, miss?" he demanded, smiling, before he had caught sight of her face. For the second time that afternoon he saw her scarlet, and now there were tears in her eyes too. She hesitated an instant. "Yes," she answered, with a painful gulp, and moved towards the door. End of Book 4, Chapter 1. Book 4, Chapter 2 of Hilda Lessways by Arnold BENNETT. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Book 4, Chapter 2, The Unknown Adventure. 1. When they were fairly out in the street, Hilda felt like a mariner who had escaped from a lee shore, but who is beset by the vaguer and even more formidable perils of the open sea. She was in a state of extreme agitation, and much too self-conscious to be properly cognizant of her surroundings. She did not feel the pavement with her feet. She had no recollection of having passed out of the house. There she was, walking along on nothing, by the side of a man who might or might not be George Cannon, amid tall objects that resembled houses. Her situation was in a high degree painful, but she could not have avoided it. She could not, in Sarah's bedroom, have fallen into sobs, or into a rage, or into the sulks, and told George Cannon that she would not go with him. She could not have dashed hysterically away and hidden herself on an upper floor in the manner of a startled fawn. Her spirit was too high for such tricks. On the other hand, she was by no means sufficiently mistress of herself to be able to hide from him her shame. Hence she faced him and followed him, and let him see it. Their long familiarity had made this surrender somewhat easier for her. After all, in the countless daily contacts they had grown accustomed to minor self-exposures, and Hilda more so than George Cannon. Hilda was too impatient and impulsive not to tear, at increasingly frequent intervals, the veil of conventional formality. Her mood now, as she accompanied George Cannon on the unknown adventure, was one of abashed but still fierce resentment. She of course believed Sarah Gailey's statement that there had been talk about herself and the landlord, and yet it was so utterly monstrous as to be almost incredible. She was absolutely sure that she had never by her behaviour furnished the slightest excuse for such talk. No eavesdropper could ever have caught the least word or gesture to justify it. Could a malicious eavesdropper have assisted at the secret operations of her inmost mind, even then he could scarcely have seen aught to justify it. Existence at Brighton had been too strenuous and strange, and with Sarah Gailey in the house too full of responsibilities, to favour dalliance. Hilda, examining herself, could not say that she had not once thought of George Cannon as a husband, because, just as a young solitary man will imagine himself the spouse of a dozen different girls in a week, so will an unmated girl picture herself united to every eligible and possibly sympathetic male that crosses her path. It is the everyday diversion of the fancy. But she could not say that she had not once thought seriously of George Cannon as a husband. Why, he was not of her generation. Although she did not know his age, she guessed that he must be nearer 40 than 30. He was of the generation of Sarah Gailey, and Sarah Gailey was the contemporary of her dead mother. And he had never shown for her any sentiment but that of a benevolently teasing kindliness. Moreover, she was afraid of him, beyond question. And withal, he patently lacked certain qualities which were to be found in her image of a perfect man. No, she had more often thought of Edwin Clayhanger as a husband. Indeed, she had married Edwin Clayhanger several times. The haunting youth would not leave her alone. And she said to herself, hot and indignant, "I shall have to leave Brighton, I can see that. Sarah Gailey's brought it on herself." Yes, she was actually angry with Sarah Gailey, who, however, had only informed her of a fact which she would have been sorry not to know. And in leaving Brighton, that fancy of hers took her straight to Bursley to stay with Janet Orgreave in the house next to the new house of the Clayhangers. Whither was George Cannon leading her? He had not said a word in explanation of the errand, nor shown in any way that he had observed her extraordinary condition. He was silent, swinging his stick. She also was silent. She could not have spoken, not even to murmur, "Where are you taking me to?" They went forward as in an enchantment. 2. They were on the King's Road, and to the left were the high hotels and houses, stretching east and west under the glare of the sun into invisibility, and to the right was the shore, and the sea so bright that the eye could scarcely rest on it. Both the upper and the lower promenades were crowded with gay people surging in different directions. The dusty roadway was full of carriages, and of the glint of the sun on wheel spokes and horses' flanks, and of rolling clear-cut shadows. The shore was bordered with flags and masts and white and brown sails, and in the white and green of billows harmlessly breaking could be seen the yellow bodies of the bathers. A dozen bare-legged men got hold of a yacht under sail with as many passengers on board, and pushed it forcibly right down into the sea, and then up sprang its nose, and it heeled over and shot suddenly off, careering on the waves into the offing, where other yachts were sliding to and fro between the piers, dominating errant fleets of rowboats. And the piers also were loaded with excited humanity and radiant colour, and all the windows of all the houses and hotels were open and blowing with curtains and flowers and hats. The whole town was enfevered. Hilda thought, her heart still beating, but less noisily, "I scarcely ever come here. I don't come here often enough." And she saw Sarah Gailey rocking and sighing and rocking and shaking her head in the mournful twilight of the basement in Preston Street. The contrasts of existence struck her as magnificent, as superb. The very misery and hopelessness of Sarah's isolation seemed romantic, splendid, touchingly beautiful. And she thought, inexplicably, "Why am I here? Why am I not at home in Turnhill? Why am I so different from what mother was? What am I going to be and to do? This that I now am can't continue for ever." She saw thousands of women with thousands of men, and quite forgetting that to the view of the multitude she was just as much as any of them with a man, and a rather fine man too, she began to pity herself because she was not with a man. She dreamed, in her extreme excitation, of belonging absolutely to some man. And, despite all her pride and independence, she dwelt with pleasure and longing on the vision of being his, of being at his disposal, of being under his might, of being helpless before him. She thought, desolated, "I am nobody's, and so there is talk." She scorned herself for being nobody's. To belong utterly to some male seemed to be the one tolerable fate for her in the world, and it was a glorious fate, whether it brought good or evil. Any other was ignobly futile, was despicable. And then she thought savagely, "And just see my clothes! Why don't I take the trouble to look nice?" Suddenly George Cannon stopped on the edge of the pavement and turned towards the houses across the street. "You see that?" he said, pointing with his stick. "What?" "The Chichester." She saw in gold letters over the front of a tall corner house, "The Chichester Private Hotel." "Well?" "I've taken it from Christmas. I signed about an hour ago. I just had to tell someone." "Well, I never!" Hilda exclaimed. He was beyond question an extraordinary and an impressive man. He'd said that, after experimenting in Preston Street, he should take a larger place, and lo, in less than a year he had fulfilled his word. He had experimented in Preston Street with immense success, and now he was coming out into the King's Road. Only those who have lived in a side street can pronounce the fine words King's Road with the proper accent of deference. And every house in the King's Road, Hilda now newly perceived, was a house of price and distinction. Nothing could be common in the King's Road. The address and the view were incomparably precious. Being established there, George Cannon might, and no doubt would, ultimately acquire one of the largest public hotels, indeed dominate the promenade. It would be just like him to do so. A year ago he was a solicitor in Turnhill. To-day he was so perfectly and entirely a landlord that no one could ever guess his first career. He was not merely extraordinary, he was astounding. There could not be many of his calibre in the whole world. "How does it strike you?" he asked, with an eagerness that touched her. "Oh, it's splendid," she answered, trying to put more natural enthusiasm into her voice. But the fact was that Chichester had not yet struck her at all. It was only the idea of being in the King's Road that had struck her, and with such an effect that her attention was happily diverted from her trouble, and her vexatious self-consciousness disappeared. She had from time to time remarked the Chichester, but never with any particularity. It had been for her just an establishment among innumerable others, and not one of the best, the reverse of imposing. It stood at the angle of King's Road and Ship Street, and a chemist's shop occupied the whole of the frontage, the hotel entrance being in Ship Street. Its architecture was flat and plain, and the place seemed neglected, perhaps unprosperous. 20 bow windows," murmured George Cannon, and then smiled at himself as if ashamed of his own naivety. And Hilda counted the windows. Yes, there were 8 on King's Road and 12 at the side. The building was high and it was deep, stretching far down Ship Street. In a moment it began to put on for Hilda quite special qualities. How high it was, how deep it was, and in what a situation! It possessed mysterious and fine characteristics which set it apart. Strange that hitherto she had been so blind to it. She and George Cannon were divided from the house by the confused and noisy traffic of the roadway, and by the streaming throngs on the opposite pavement. And none of these people riding or driving or walking, and none of the people pushing past them on the pavement behind, guessed that here on the curb was the future master of the Chichester, an amazing man, and that she, Hilda Lessways, by his side, was the woman to whom he had chosen first to relate his triumph. This unrecognized secrecy in the great animated street was piquant and agreeable to Hilda, a source of pride. "I suppose you've bought it?" she ventured. She had no notion of his financial resources, but her instinct was to consider them infinite. "No, I've not exactly bought it," he laughed. "Not quite. I've got the lease from Christmas. How much do you think the rent is?" He seemed to challenge her. "Oh, don't ask me." 500 a year, he said, and raised his chin. 500 a year, £10 a week, nearly 30 shillings a day. You've got to pay that before you can even begin to think of your own profits." "But it's enormous." Hilda was staggered. All her mother's houses put together had brought in scarcely a third of the rental of that single house, which was nevertheless only a modest unit in several miles of houses. "But can you make it pay?" "I fancy so, else I shouldn't have taken it. The present man can't. But then he's paying £550 for one thing, and he's old, and he doesn't know his business. Oh yes, I think I can see my money back. Wait till Christmas is turned and I make a start." She knew that the future would justify his self-confidence. How he succeeded she could not define. Why should he succeed where another was failing? He could not go out and drag boarders by physical force into his private hotel. Yet he would succeed. In every gesture he was the successful man. She looked timidly up at his eyes under the strong black eyelashes. His glance caught hers. He smiled conqueringly. "Haven't said a word to Sarah yet," he almost whispered, so low was his voice, and he put on a mock rueful smile. Hilda smiled in response. "Shall you keep Preston Street?" she asked. "Of course," he said with pride. "I shall run the two, naturally." He put his shoulders back. "One will help the other, don't you see?" She thought she saw, and nodded appreciatively. He meant to run 2 establishments. At the same moment a young and stylish man drove rather slowly by in a high dog-cart. He nodded carelessly to George Cannon, and then, perceiving that George Cannon was with a lady, raised his hat in haste. George Cannon responded. The young man gazed for an instant hard at Hilda with a peculiar expression, and passed on. She did not know who he was. Of George Cannon's relationships in the town she was entirely ignorant, but that he had relationships was always obvious. She blushed, thinking of what Sarah Gailey had said about talk concerning herself and George Cannon. In the young man's glance there had been something to annoy and shame her. "Come across and have a look at the place," said George Cannon, suddenly stepping down into the gutter, with a look first in one direction and then in the other for threatening traffic. "I don't think I'll come now," she replied. "But why not? Are you in a hurry? You've plenty of time before 5 o'clock, heaps." "I prefer not to come," she insisted, in an abashed and diffident voice. "But what's up?" he demanded, stepping back to the pavement and glancing directly into her eyes. She blushed more and more, dropping her eyelids. "I don't want to be talked about too much," she muttered, mortified. Her inference was unmistakable. The whole of her mind seemed now to be occupied with an enormous grievance which she somehow had against the world in general. Her very soul, too, was bursting with this grievance. "Talked about? But who?" "Never mind, I know, I've been told," she interrupted him. "Oh, I see." He was now understanding the cause of her trouble in Sarah Gailey's bedroom. "Now look here," he went on, "I've just got to have a few words with you. You come across the road, please." He was imperious. She raised her glance for a timid moment to his face, and saw to her intense astonishment that he also was blushing. Never before had she seen him blush. "Come along," he urged. She followed him obediently across the dangerous road. He waited for her at the opposite curb, and then they went up Ship Street. He turned into the entrance of the Chichester, which was grandiose, with a flight of shallow steps, and then a porch with 2 basket chairs, and then another flight of shallow steps ending in double doors which were noticeably higher than the street level. She still followed. "Nobody in here, I expect," said George Cannon, indicating a door on the right to an old waiter who stood in the dark hall. "No, sir." George Cannon opened the door as a master, ushered Hilda into a tiny room furnished with a desk and 2 chairs, and shut the door. 3. The small window was of ground glass, and gave no prospect of the outer world, from which it seemed to Hilda that she was as completely cut off as in a prison. She was alone with George Cannon, and beyond the narrow walls which caged them together and close together, there was nothing. All Brighton, save this room, had ceased to exist. Hilda was now more than ever affrighted, shamed, perturbed, agonized. Yet at the same time she had the desperate calm of the captain of a ship about to founder with all hands. And she saw glimpses, beautiful and compensatory, of the romantic quality of common life. She was in a little office of a perfectly ordinary boarding-house. She could even detect the stale odours of cooking. With a realistic man of business, and they were about to discuss a perfectly ordinary piece of scandal, and surely they might be called 2 common-sense people. And withal, the ordinariness and the Midland gumption of the scene were shot through with the bright exotic rays of romance. She thought, "It is painful and humiliating to be caught and fixed as I am, but it is wonderful too." "The fact is," said George Cannon in an easy, reassuring tone, "we never get the chance of a bit of quiet chat. Upon my soul we don't. Now I suppose it's Sarah who's been worrying you?" "Yes." "What did she say? You'd better sit down, don't you think?" He swung round the pivoted armchair in front of the closed desk and pointed her to it. "Oh!" Hilda hesitated, and then sank onto the chair without looking at it. "She simply said that there was a lot of talk about you and me. Has she been saying anything to you?" He shook his head, staring down at her. Hilda put her arms on the arms of the chair, and, shirking the man's gaze, stared down at the worn carpet and at his boots thereon. One instinct in her desired that he should move away, or that the room should be larger, but another instinct wanted him to remain close, lest the savour of life should lose its sharpness. "It passes me how people can say such things," she went on, in a low, thrilled, meditative voice. "I can't understand it." She was quite sincere in her astonished indignation. Nevertheless, she experienced a positive pride at being brought into a scandal with George Cannon. She derived from it a certain feeling of importance. It proved that she was no longer a mere girlish miss. George Cannon kept silence. "I shall leave Brighton," Hilda continued. "That I've quite decided. I don't like leaving your sister as ill as she is, but really—" And she thought how prudent she was, and how capable of taking care of herself, she all alone in the world. "Where should you go to? Bursley, the Orgreaves?" George Cannon asked absently and carelessly. "I don't know," said Hilda with curtness. He stepped aside in the direction of the window, and examined curiously the surface of the glass, as though in search of a concealed message which it might contain. In a new and much more animated voice he said to the window, "Of course I know it's all my fault." Hilda glanced up at his back, and he was still not more than 3 feet away from her. "How is it your fault?" she asked after a pause. He made another pause. "The way I look at you," he said. These apparently simple words made Hilda tremble and deprived her of speech. They shifted the conversation to another plane. "The way I look at you? The way I look at you? What did he mean? How did he look at her?" She could not imagine what he was driving at. Yes, she could. She knew quite well. All the time, while pretending to herself not to understand, she understood. It was staggering, but she perfectly understood. He had looked at her like that on the very first day of their acquaintance in his office at Turnhill, and again at the house in Lessways Street, and again in the newspaper office, and on other occasions, and again on the night of their arrival at Brighton. But surely not lately. Or did he look at her like that behind her back? Was it possible that people noticed it? Absurd! His explanation of the origin of the gossip did not convince her. She had, however, suddenly lost interest in the origin of the gossip. She was entirely occupied with George Cannon's tone, and his calm, audacious reference to a phenomenon which had hitherto seemed to her to be far beyond the region of words. She was frightened. She was like someone walking secure in the night, who is stopped by the sound of rushing water, and stands with all his senses astrain, afraid to move a step farther, too absorbed and intimidated to be aware of astonishment. The point was not whether or not she had known or guessed the existence of this unseen and formidable river. The point was that she was thrillingly on its brink, in the dark. Every instant she heard its swelling current plainer and plainer. She thought, "Am I lost? How strange that this awful and exquisite thing should happen to just me!" She was quite fatalistic. He turned his head suddenly and caught her guilty eyes for an instant before she could lower them. "You don't mean to say you don't know what I mean?" he said. She still could not speak. Her trouble was acute, her self-consciousness far keener than it had ever been before. She thought, "But it's impossible that this awful and exquisite thing should happen in this fashion." George Cannon moved a step towards her. She could not see his face, but she knew that he was looking at her with his expression at once tyrannic and benevolent. She could feel, beating upon her, the emanating waves of his personality, and she was as confused as though she had been sitting naked in front of him. And he had brought all this about by simply putting something into words, by saying, "It's the way I look at you." He went on, "I can't help it, you know. The very first minute I ever set eyes on you. Of course I'm 36, but there it is. I've never seen anyone like you, and I've seen a few. The fact is, Hilda, I do believe you don't know how fine you are." He spoke more quickly and with boyish enthusiasm. His voice became wonderfully persuasive. "You are fine, you know, and you're beautiful. I didn't think so at first, but you are. You're being wasted. Why, a woman like you? You've no idea. You're so proud and stiff when you want to be. I'd trust you with anything. You're absolutely the only woman I ever met that I'd trust like a man, and that's a fact. Now, nobody could ever think as much of you as I do. I'm quite certain of it. It couldn't be done. I know you, you see. I understand everything you do, and whatever you do, it's just fine for me. You couldn't be as happy with anyone else. You couldn't. I feel that in my bones. Now I must tell you something." The praise, the sympathy, the passion were astounding, marvellous, and delicious to her. Was it conceivable that this experienced and worldly man had been captivated by such a mere girl as herself? She had never guessed it, or had she always guessed it? An intense pride warmed her blood like a powerful cordial. Life was even grander than she had thought. She drooped into an intoxication. Among all that he had said, he had not said that he was not stronger than she. He had not relinquished his authority. She felt it sitting almost beneath him in the slippery chair. She knew that she would yield to him. She desired to yield to him. Her mind was full of sensuous images based on the abdication of her will in favour of his. "Now look here, Hilda, I want to tell you." He perhaps did not intend that she should look up, but she looked up, and she was surprised to see that his face was full of troubled hesitations, showing almost dismay. He made the motion of swallowing. She smiled and set her shoulders back, the very gesture that she had learned from him. "What?" she questioned in a whisper. Her brief mood of courage was over. She sank before him again and waited with bowed head. Profoundly disturbed, he stood quite still for a few seconds with shut lips, and then he made another step to approach. "Your name's got to be Cannon," she heard him say. She thought, still waiting, "If this goes on a moment longer, I shall die of anticipation, in bliss." And when she felt his hand on her shoulder, and the great shadow of him on part of her face, her body seemed to sigh, acquiescent, and for the moment assuaged. "This is a miracle. Her life is miraculous." She acknowledged that she had lacked faith in life. She was now on the river, whirling, but at the same time she was in the small, hot room, and both George Cannon's hands were on her unresisting shoulders, and then they were round her, and she felt his physical nearness, the texture of his coat and of his skin. She could see in a mist the separate hairs of his tremendous moustache, and the colours swimming in his eyes. Her nostrils expanded in transient alarm to a faint, exciting, masculine odour. She was disconcerted, if not panic-struck, by the violence of his first kiss, but her consternation was delectable to her. And amid her fright and her joy, and the wonder of her extreme surprise, and the preoccupation of being whirled down the river, she calmly reflected somewhere in her brain, "The door is not locked. Supposing someone were to come in and see us?" And she reflected also in an ecstasy of relief, "My life will be quite simple now. I shall have nothing to worry about, and I can help him." For during a year past she had never ceased to ask herself what she must do to arrange her life. Her conscience had never ceased to tell her that she ought not to be content to remain in the narrow ideas of her mother, and that though she preferred marriage, she ought to act independently of the hope of it. Throughout her long stay in Preston Street she had continually said, "After this, what? This cannot last for ever. When it comes to an end, what am I to do to satisfy my conscience?" And she had thought vaguely of magnificent activities and purposes, she knew not what. The problem existed no more. Her life was arranged. And now, far more sincerely than in the King's Road 20 minutes earlier, she regarded the career of a spinster with horror and with scorn. At best, she suddenly perceived with blinding clearness, it would have been pitiful. Pitiful! 20 minutes earlier, in the King's Road, she had dreamt of belonging absolutely to some man, of being at his disposal, of being under his might, of being helpless before him. And now, miracle thrice miraculous, miracle unconceived, inconceivable, no more talk now. She told herself how admirable was the man. She assured herself that he was entirely admirable. She reminded herself that she had always deemed him admirable, that only 20 minutes earlier in the King's Road, when there was in her mind no dimmest, wildest notion of the real future, she had genuinely admired him. How clever, how tactful, how indomitable, how conquering, how generous, how kind he was! How kind to his half-sister, how forbearing with her! Indeed, she could not recall his faults. And he was inevitably destined to brilliant success. She would be the wife of a great and wealthy man. And in her own secret way she could influence him, and thus be greater than the great. Love? It is an absolute fact that the name of love did not in the first eternal moments even occur to her, and when it did she gave it but little importance. She had to admit that she had not consciously thought of George Cannon with love, at any rate with love as she had imagined love to be. Indeed, her immediate experience would not fit any theory that she could formulate. But, with the inexorable realism of her sex, she easily dismissed inconvenient names and theories, and accommodated herself to the fact. And the fact was that she overwhelmingly wanted George Cannon, and as she now recognized, had wanted him ever since she first saw him. The recognition afforded her intense pleasure. She abandoned herself candidly to this luxury of an unknown desire. It was incomparably the most splendid and dangerous experience that she had ever had. She did not reason, and she had no wish to reason. She was set above reason. Happy to the point of delicious pain, she yet yearned forward to a happiness far more excruciating. She was perfectly aware that her bliss would be torment until George Cannon had married her, until she had wholly surrendered to him. Yet, at intervals, a voice said very clearly within her, "All this is wrong. This is base and shameful. This is something to blush for, really." She did blush, but her blushes were a part of the delight, and the voice was not persistent. She could silence it with scarcely an effort, despite its clarity. "Kiss me," George Cannon demanded of her with eager masterfulness. The request shocked her for an instant, and the young girl in her was about to revolt. But she kissed him, an act which combined the sweetness of submission with the glory of triumph. She looked at him steadily, confident in herself and in him. She felt that he knew how to love. His emotion filled her with superb pride. She seemed to be saying to him in a doomed rapture, "Do you think I don't know what I'm doing? I know. I know." The current of the river was tremendous. She foresaw the probability of disaster. She was aware that she had definitely challenged the hazard of fate. But she was not terrified in the dark, swirling night of her destiny. She straightened her shoulders. With all her innocence and ignorance and impulsiveness and weakness, she had behind her the unique and priceless force of her youth. She was young, and she put her trust in life. End of Book 4, Chapter 2. Book 4, Chapter 3 of Hilda Lessways by Arnold BENNETT. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Book 4, Chapter 3, Florrie Again. 1. As they were walking home along the King's Road, Hilda suddenly stopped in front of a chemist's shop. "I've got something to buy here," she said diffidently, and then added, "I'll follow you." "And what have you got to buy?" he asked, facing her with his benevolent, ironical expression. "Never mind," she gently laughed. "I shan't be many minutes after you." She pretended to make a mystery, but her sole purpose was to avoid re-entering the house in his company, and she knew that he had divined this. Nevertheless, she found pleasure in the perfectly futile pretence of a mysterious purchase. She was very self-conscious as they stood there on the dusty footpath amid the promenaders, gay and gloomy, chattering and silent, who were taking the sun and the salt breeze. Despite her reason, she had a fear that numbers of people would perceive her to be newly affianced, and remark upon the contrast between her girlishness and his maturity. But George Cannon was not in the slightest degree self-conscious. He played the lover with ease, and said, quite simply and convincingly, just the things which she would have expected a lover to say. Indeed, the conversation, as carried on by him, between the moment of betrothal and the arrival at the chemist's shop, was the one phenomenon of the engagement which corresponded with her preconceived ideas concerning such an affair. It convinced her that she really was affianced. "Well?" he murmured fondly and yet quizzically as they remained wordless, deliciously hesitating to part. "What are you thinking about?" She replied with brave candour, appealing to him by a soft glance. "I was only thinking how queer it is I should be engaged in a room I've never seen before in my life, going into it like that." He looked at her uncomprehending. For an instant his features were blank. Then he smiled kindly. "It's so strange," she encouraged him. "Yes, isn't it?" he agreed with charming, tranquil politeness. "He doesn't see it," she thought, as she watched the play of his face. "He doesn't see how wonderful it is that I should go into a room that was absolutely unknown to me, and then this should happen at once. Why, I never knew there was such a room." She could not define how she was affected by this fact, but she regarded the fact as tremendously romantic, and its effect on her was profound. And George saw in it no significance. She was disconcerted. She felt a tremor. It was as though the entire King's Road had quivered for a fraction of a second, and then, feigning nonchalance, resumed its moveless solidity. Inside the chemist's she demanded the first thing she set eyes on, a toothbrush. All the while she was examining various shapes of toothbrushes, she had a vision of George raising his hat to take leave of her, and she could see not only the curve of his hand and the whiteness of his cuff, but also the millions of tiny marks and creases on the coarse skin of his face, extraordinarily different from her own smooth, pure, delicate, silky complexion. And she remembered that less than 3 years ago she had regarded him as of another generation, as indefinitely older and infinitely more experienced than her childish and simple self. This reflection produced in her a consternation which was curiously blissful. "No, madam," the white-aproned chemist was saying, "it's this size that we usually sell to ladies." She put on the serious judicial air of an authentic adult woman, and frowned at the chemist. 2. When, in Preston Street, she was reluctantly approaching the house, she saw a cab coming downwards in the opposite direction stop at number 59. "That must be Florrie," she said half aloud. The boarding-house being in need of another servant, young, strong, and reliable, Hilda had suggested that Miss Florence Bagster might be invited to accept the situation. Sarah Gailey had agreed that it would be wise to have a servant from Turnhill. She mistrusted southern servants, and appeared to believe that there was no real honesty south of the Trent. Florence Bagster had accepted the situation with enthusiasm, writing that she longed to be again with her former mistress. She did not write that the mysterious and magnetic name of Brighton called her more loudly than the name of her former mistress. And now Florence was due. But it was not Florence who emerged from the cab. It was a tall and full-bosomed young lady in a gay multicoloured costume, and gloves, and a sunshade, and a striking hat. This young lady stood by the cab, expectant and smiling, while the cabman pulled a tin trunk off the roof of the vehicle, and then, when the cabman had climbed down and was dragging the trunk after him, she put out an arm and seized one handle of the trunk to help him, which act, so strange on the part of a young lady, made Hilda, coming nearer and nearer, look more carefully. She was astounded as she realized that the unknown young lady was not a young lady after all, but the familiar Florrie at the advanced age of 16. The aged cabman had made no mistake. He left the tin trunk on the pavement and took timid Florrie's money without touching his hat for it. Florrie was laying her sunshade rather forlornly on the top of the tin trunk and preparing to lift the trunk unaided, when Mr. Boutwood, stout and all in black, came gallantly forth from the house to assist her. Sarah Gailey's opposition had not been persistent enough to keep the jovial Mr. Boutwood out of number 59. Shortly after Christmas his wife had died suddenly, and Mr. Boutwood, with plenty of time and plenty of money on his hands, had found himself desolated. In his desolation he had sought his old acquaintance George Cannon, and the result had somehow been that bygones had become bygones, and a new boarder had increased the prosperity of number 59. Sarah Gailey could not object. Indeed, she had actually wept for the death of one enemy and the affliction of another. Moreover, she seldom had contact with the boarders now. The rather peculiar circumstances of Florrie's arrival almost cured Hilda's self-consciousness, and she entered the house in the wake of the trunk with a certain forgetful ease. There was Mr. Boutwood, still dallying with Florence and the trunk in the narrow hall. The shocking phenomenon of a boarder helping a domestic servant with her luggage had been rendered possible only by a series of accidents. The front door being left open on account of the weather, Mr. Boutwood had had a direct view of the maiden, and the maiden had not been obliged to announce her arrival officially by ringing a bell. Hence the other servants had not had notice, and of the overseers of the house, one was imprisoned in the basement, and the other two had been out betrothing themselves. In the ordinary way, the slightest unusualness in the hall would instantly attract the attention of somebody in authority. Mr. Boutwood was not immediately aware of Hilda. His attitude towards Florrie was shocking to Hilda in a double sense. It shocked her as an overseer, but it shocked her quite as much as a young woman newly jealous for the pride of all her sex. Florrie was beyond question exceedingly pretty. In particular, the chin pouted more deliriously than ever. Her complexion was even finer than Hilda's own. She had a simple, good-natured glance, a quick and extraordinarily seductive smile, and the unique bodily grace of her years. Her costume, though vulgar and very ill-made, was effective at a little distance. Her form and movements gave it a fictitious worth. Indeed, she was an amazing blossom to have come off the dunghill of Calder Street. Domestic drudgery had not yet dehumanized nor disfigured her. It is true that her hands were concealed in gloves, and her feet beneath a flowing skirt. Now Mr. Boutwood's attitude showed very plainly that the girlish charms of Florrie had produced in him a definite and familiar effect. He would have been ready to commit follies for the young woman, and to deny that she was a drudge or anything but a beautiful creature. Hilda objected. She objected because Mr. Boutwood was a widower, holding that he had no right to joy, and that he ought to mourn practically for ever in solitude. She would make no allowance for his human instincts, his needs of intimate companionship, his enormous unoccupied leisure. She would have condemned him utterly on the score of his widowhood alone. But she objected far more strongly to his attitude because he was fat and looked somewhat coarse. She counted his obesity to him for a sin, and it was naught to her that he had been a martyr to idleness and wealth, which combination had prematurely aged him. Mr. Boutwood was really younger than George Cannon, and Florence Bagster certainly seemed as old as Hilda. Yet the juxtaposition of the young, slim, and virginal Florrie and the large, earth-worn Mr. Boutwood profoundly offended her. It was Mr. Boutwood who first discovered that Hilda was in the doorway. He was immediately abashed, and presented the most foolish appearance, whereupon Hilda added scorn to her disgust. Florrie, however, easily kept her countenance, and, with a pert smile, took the hand which her former mistress graciously extended. By universal custom, a servant retains some of the privileges of humanity for several minutes after entering upon a new servitude. Mr. Boutwood vanished. "Louisa will help you upstairs with the trunk," said Hilda, when she had made inquiries about the wonderful journey which Florrie had accomplished alone, and about the health of Florrie's aunt and of her family. "Louisa!" she called loudly upstairs and down into the basement. 3. She followed the procession of the trunk upstairs, and, Louisa having descended again, showed Florrie into the kennel. This tiny apartment had in it 2 truckle beds and a wash-bowl on a chair, and little else. A very small square trap window in the low ceiling procured a dusky light in the middle hours of the day. Florence seemed delighted with the room. She might have had to sleep under the stairs. "Put on your afternoon apron, and then you could go down and see Miss Gailey," said Hilda, and shut the door upon Florrie in her new home. When she turned, there was George Cannon on the half-landing beneath the skylight. She knew not how he had come there, nor whether he had entered the house before or after herself. "I'm glad he isn't fat," she thought, and it was as though she had thought, if he were fat everything would be different. Her features did not relax as she went down the 5 steps to the half-landing where he waited, smiling faintly. She thought, we must be very serious and circumspect in the house. There must never be the slightest— But when she was yet on the last step, he firmly put his hands on her ears, and, drawing her head towards him, kissed her full on the mouth, and she saw again through her eyelashes all the details of his face. She yielded. All her ideas of circumspection melted magically away in an abandoned tenderness of which she was ashamed, but for which she would have unreflectingly made any sacrifice. The embrace was over in an instant. Besides being guiltless of obesity, George Cannon was free from the unpardonable fault of clumsiness. He was audacious, but he was not foolhardy, and he would never be abashed. True, she had seen dismay on his face at the moment of his declaration, but that moment was unique, and his dismay had ineffably flattered her. Now, on the half landing, she was drenched in bliss. And she felt dissolute, she felt even base. But she did not care. She thought, as it were, startled, "This is love. This must be what love is. I must have been in love without knowing it. And as for a girl always knowing when a man's in love with her, and foreseeing the proposal and all that sort of thing—" Her practical contempt for all that sort of thing could not be stated in words. "Florrie's just come," she whispered, and by a movement of the head indicated that Florrie was in the kennel. They went together to the drawing-room on the first floor. It was empty, the entire population of the boarding-houses being still on the seashore. Hilda stood near the door, which she left open, and gave detailed news of Florrie in a tone very matter-of-fact. There was no reference to love, or to the new situation created, or to the vast enterprise of the Chichester. The topic was Florrie, and somehow it held the field despite efforts to dislodge it. Then the stairs creaked. Already Florrie was coming down. In a trice she had made herself ready for work. She came down timidly, not daring to look to right nor left, but concentrating her attention on the stairs. She passed along the landing outside the drawing-room door, and Hilda, opening the door a little wider, had a full surreptitious view of her back, and George Cannon, farther within the room, also saw her. They watched her disappear on her way to find the basement and the formidable Sarah Gailey. Hilda was touched by the spectacle of this child disguised as a strapping woman, far removed from her family and her companions and her familiar haunts, and driven or drawn into exile at Brighton, where she would only see the sea once a week, except through windows, and where she would have to work from 14 to 16 hours a day for a living, and sleep in a kennel. The prettiness, the pertness, and the naive contentedness of the child thus realizing an ambition touched her deeply. "It does seem a shame, doesn't it?" she said. "What?" "Bringing her all the way up here like this. She doesn't know a soul in Brighton. She's bound to be frightfully homesick." "What about you?" George Cannon interrupted politely. "Doesn't she know you?" He smiled with all his kindness. "Yes, but—" Hilda did not finish. It was not worth while. George Cannon had not understood. He did not feel as she felt, and her emotion was incommunicable to him. A tremendous misgiving seized her, and she had a physical feeling of emptiness in the stomach. It passed swiftly as a hallucination. Just such a misgiving as visits nearly every normal person immediately before or immediately after marriage. She ignored it. She was engaged. That was the paramount fact. She was engaged and joyously determined to prosecute the grand adventure to the end. The immensity of the risks forced her to accept them. 4. That evening Sarah Gailey was in torment from the pain in her wrists. There was nothing to be done. She had had the doctor, and no article of the prescribed treatment had been neglected. With unaccustomed aid from Hilda she had accomplished the business of undressing and getting into bed, and now she sat up in bed, supported by her own pillows and one from Hilda's bed, and nursed her wrists, while Hilda poured drops of a narcotic for her into a glass of water. Apart from the serious local symptoms, her health was fairly good. She could eat, she could talk, she could walk, and her brain was clear. Hilda held the glass for her to drink, for it was prudent to keep her hands as much as possible in repose. "There," said Hilda, as if to a young child who had been querulous. "I'm sure you'll sleep now." "I don't think I shall," the sufferer whined. "Oh, yes, you will," Hilda insisted firmly, although she was by no means sure. "Let me take this extra pillow away, and then you can lie down properly." She was thinking reproachfully, "What a pity it is for all of us that the poor thing can't bear her pain with a little less fuss." It was not Sarah alone who was embittered and fatigued by Sarah's pain. "Where's George?" asked the invalid when she was laid down. "In the parlour. Why?" "Oh, nothing." "By the way," said Hilda, seized by a sudden impulse which had its origin in Sarah's tone at once martyrized and accusing, "by the way, who is it that has been talking scandal about me and George?" "Scandal?" Sarah Gailey seemed weakly to protest against the word. "Because if you want to know," Hilda continued, "we're engaged to be married." She reflected, contrite. This won't help her to sleep. and then added in a new endearing accent, awaiting an outburst of some kind from Sarah, "Of course it's a secret, dear. I'm telling no one but you." After a moment's silence, Sarah remarked casually, with shut eyes, "It'll be much the best not to tell anyone, and the shorter the engagement the better. Don't let anybody in the house know till you're married." She sighed, put her cheek into the pillow, and moved her bound wrists for a few seconds restlessly. "If you turn the gas down," she finished very wearily, "I dare say I might get off. If only they'd stop that piano upstairs." She had displayed no surprise at the tremendous event, no sentimental interest in it. The fact was that Sarah Gailey's wrists were infinitely more interesting to her than any conceivable project of marriage. Continuous and acute pain had withdrawn her from worldly affairs, making her more than ever like a god. Hilda was startled, but she was relieved. Now for the first time she had the authentic sensation of being engaged, and it appeared to her that she had been engaged for a very long period, and that the engagement was a quite ordinary affair. She was relieved, yet she was also grievously saddened. She lowered the gas, and in the gloom gazed for a few seconds at the vague, huddled, sheeted, faintly moaning figure on the bed. The untidy grey hair against the pillow struck her as intolerably pathetic. "Good night," she said softly, and the feeble, plaintive voice responded, "Good night." She went out, leaving the door slightly ajar. 5. In the parlour adjoining, George Cannon was seated at the table. When Hilda saw him and their eyes met, she was comforted. A wave of tenderness seemed to agitate her. She realized that this man was hers, and the realization was marvellously reassuring. The sound of the piano descended delicately from the drawing-room, as from a great distance. From the kitchen came the muffled clatter of earthenware, and occasionally a harsh, loud voice. It was the hour of relaxed discipline in the kitchen, where, amid the final washing up and much free discussion and banter, Florrie was recommencing her career on a grander basis. Hilda closed the door very quietly. When she had closed it and was shut in with George Cannon, her emotion grew intenser. "I think she'll get off now," she whispered, standing near the door. "Have you told her?" Hilda nodded. "What does she say?" Hilda raised her eyebrows. "Oh, well, she says we'd better keep it quiet, and make the engagement as short as possible." She blushed. "Look here," said George, "let's go out, eh?" "But what will people say?" "What the devil does it matter what they say? I want you to come out with me." The whispered oath and his defiant smile enchanted her. "We can go out by the area steps," he continued. "There's 2 of them sitting in the hall, but the front door's shut. Do go and get your hat." She left the room with an obedient smile. Pushing open Sarah's door very gently, she groped on the hooks behind it for her hat. "It won't matter about gloves in the dark," she thought. "Besides, I mustn't disturb her." Before drawing to the door, she looked again at the bed. There was neither sound nor movement. Probably Sarah Gailey slept. The dim vision of the form on the bed and the blue spark of gas in the corner produced in Hilda a mood of poignant and yet delicious sorrow. "Why, what's the matter?" George Cannon asked when she had returned to the parlour. She knew that her eyes were humid with tears. Both her arms were raised above her head as she fixed the hat. This act of fixing the hat in George's presence gave her a new pleasure. She smiled at him. "Nothing," she said, whispering mysteriously. "I think she's gone off. I'm so glad. You know, she really does suffer dreadfully." His look was uncomprehending, but she did not care. The anticipation of going out with him was now utterly absorbing her. He waited with his hand on the gas tap till she was ready, and then he lowered the gas. "Wait a moment," she whispered at the door, and with a gesture called him back into the room from the flagged passage leading to the area steps. On the desk was his evening glass of milk, which he drank cold in summer. She offered it to him in the twilit room like an enraptured handmaid. He had forgotten it. The fact that he had forgotten it and she had remembered it yet further increased her strange, mournful, ecstatic bliss. "Have some," he whispered when he had drunk. She finished the glass, trembling. They went forth, climbing the area steps with proper precautions, and escaping as thieves escape down the street. For an instant she glimpsed the wide open windows of the drawing-room and the dining-room, from behind whose illuminated blinds came floating, as it were wistfully, the sound of song and chatter. She thought of Sarah Gailey, prone and unconscious in the basement, and she felt the moisture of the milk on her lips. "Am I happy or unhappy?" she questioned herself, and could not reply. She knew only that she was thrillingly, smartingly alive. At the corner of Preston Street and King's Road a landau waited. "This is ours," said George casually. "Ours?" What a splendid masculine idea! How it proved that he too had been absorbed in the adventure! She admired him humbly, like a girl, like a little girl. With the most formal deference he helped her into the carriage. "Drive towards Shoreham," he commandingly directed the driver, and took his place by her side. Yes, he was mature, he was a man of the world, he had had every experience, he knew how to love. That such a being was hers, that she, without any effort, had captured such a being, flattered her to an extreme degree. She was glorious with pride. She leaned back in the carriage negligently, affecting an absolute calm. She armed herself in her virginity. Not George Cannon himself could have guessed that only by a miracle of self-control did she prevent her hand from seeking his beneath the light rug that covered their knees. She intimidated George Cannon in that hour, and the while her heart burned with shame at the secret violence of her feelings. She thought, "This must be love, this is love," and yet her conscience inarticulately accused her of obliquity. But she did not care, and she would not reflect. She thought that she wilfully, perversely refused to reflect, but in reality she was quite helpless. Under the still and feverish night the landau rolled slowly along between the invisible murmuring sea and the lighted facades of Hove. Occasionally other carriages, containing other couples, approached, were plain for a moment, and dissolved away. "So she thinks the engagement ought to be short," said George Cannon. "Yes." "So do I," he pronounced with emphasis. Hilda desired to ask him, "How short?" but she could not. She could not bring herself to put the question. She was too proud. By a short engagement did he mean 6 months, 3 months, a month? Dared she hope that he meant a month? This was a thought buried in the deepest fastness of her soul, a thought that she would have perished in order not to expose, but it existed. "I think I should like to go back now," she breathed timidly, before they were beyond Hove. It was not a request to be ignored. The carriage turned. She felt relief. The sensation of being alive had been too acute to be borne, and it was now a little eased. She knew that her destiny was irrevocable, that nothing could prevent her from being George Cannon's. Whether the destiny was evil or good did not paramountly interest her. But she wanted to rush forward into the arms of fate and know her fate. She dreamed only of the union. End of Book 4, Chapter 3. Book 5, Chapter 1 of Hilda Lessways by Arnold BENNETT. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Book 5, Her Deliverance. Chapter 1, Louisa Uncontrolled. 1. Hilda, after a long railway journey, was bathing her face, arms, and neck at the large double washstand in the large double bedroom on the second floor of number 59 Preston Street. At the back of the washstand was an unused door, which gave into a small bedroom occupied by the youngest Miss Watchett. George Cannon came up quietly behind her. She pretended not to hear him. He put his hands lightly on her wet arms. Smiling with condescending indulgence, half to herself, she still pretended to ignore him, and continued her toilet. The return from the honeymoon, which she had feared, had accomplished itself quite simply and easily. She had feared the return, because only upon the return was the marriage to be formally acknowledged and published. It had been obviously impossible to announce, during the strenuous summer season, the engagement of the landlord to a young woman who lived under the same roof with him. The consequences of such an indiscretion would have been in various ways embarrassing. Hence not a word was said. Nor were definite plans for the wedding made until George remarked one evening that he would like to be married at Chichester, Chichester being the name of his new private hotel. Which exhibition of sentimentality had both startled and touched Hilda. Chichester, however, had to be renounced owing to the difficulty of residence. The subject having been thus fairly broached, George had pursued it, and one day somewhat casually stated that he had taken a room in Lewes, and meant to sleep there every night for the term imposed by the law. Less than 3 weeks later, Hilda had inobtrusively departed from number 59, the official account being that she was to take a holiday with friends after the fatigues of August and early September. She left the train at Lewes, and there, in the presence of strangers, was married to George Canning, who had quitted Brighton 2 days earlier and was supposed to be in London on business. Even Sarah Gailey, though her health had improved, did not assist at the wedding. Sarah, sole depository of the secret, had to remain in charge of number 59. A strange wedding. Not a single wedding present except those interchanged by the principals. Nor had any of the problems raised by the marriage been solved or attacked. The future of Sarah Gailey, for example, was Sarah to go on living with them? It was inconceivable, and yet the converse was also inconceivable. Sarah had said nothing, and nothing had been said to Sarah. Matters were to settle themselves. It had not even been decided which room Mr. and Mrs. Cannon should inhabit as man and wife. It was almost certain that, in the dead period between the popular summer season and the fashionable autumn season, there would be several bedrooms empty. Hilda, like George, did not want to bother with a lot of tedious details, important or unimportant. The attitude of each was, "Let me get married first, and then I'll see to all that." Thus had the return been formidable to Hilda. All the way from Ireland she had been saying to herself, "I shall have to go up the steps and into the house and be spoken to as Mrs. Cannon, and then there'll be Sarah." But the entry into the house had produced no terror. Everywhere George's adroitness had been wonderful, extraordinarily comforting and reassuring, and nowhere more so than in the vestibule of number 59. The tone in which he had said to Louisa, "Take Mrs. Cannon's handbag, Louisa," had been a marvel of ease. Louisa had incontestably blenched, for the bizarre Sarah, who conserved in Brighton the inmost spirit of the Five Towns, had thought fit to tell the servants nothing whatever. But the trained veteran in Louisa had instantly recovered, and she had replied, "Yes, sir," with a simplicity which proved her to be the equal of George Cannon. The worst was over for Hilda, and the next moments were made smooth by reason of a great piece of news, which, forcing Sarah Gailey to communicate it at once, monopolized attention, and so entirely relieved the bride's self-consciousness. Florence Bagster, having incidentally quarrelled with her mistress, had left her service without notice. Mr. Boutwood had also gone, and the connection between the two departures was only too apparent, not merely to Sarah, but also to the 3 Miss Watchets who had recently arrived. Florence, who could but whisper, had shouted at her mistress. Little flushing, modest Florrie, who yesterday in the Five Towns was an infant, had compromised herself with a fat widower certainly old enough to be her father. And the widower, the friend of the house, had had so little regard for the feelings of the house that he had not hesitated to flaunt with Florrie in the town. It was known that they were more or less together, and that he stood between Florrie and the world. 2. "I suppose I'd better write at once to her mother, or perhaps her aunt. Her aunt's got more sense," said Hilda, as she dropped the sponge and groped for a towel, her eyes half blinded. In moving she had escaped from his hands. "What do you say?" she asked, having heard a vague murmur through the towel. "I say you can write if you like." George spoke with a careless smile. Now, facing her, he put his hands on her damp shoulders. She looked up at him over the towel, leaning her head forward and suspending action. Her nose was about a foot from his. She saw, as she had seen 100 times, every detail of his large, handsome, and yet time-worn face, every hair of his impressive moustache, all the melting shades of colour in his dark eyes. His charm was coarse and crude, but he was very skilful, and there was something about his experienced, weather-beaten, slightly depraved air which excited her. She liked to feel young and girlish before him. She liked to feel that with him, alone of all men, her modesty availed nothing. She was beginning to realize her power over him, and of the extent of it. It was a power miraculous and mysterious, never claimed by her, and never admitted by him, save in glance and gesture. This power lay in the fact that she was indispensable to him. He was not her slave. She might indeed have been considered the human chattel, but he was the slave of his need of her. He loved her. In him she saw what love was. She had seen it more and more clearly ever since the day of their engagement. She was both proud and ashamed of her power. He did not possess a similar power over herself. She was fond of him, perhaps getting fonder, but his domination of her senses was already nearly at an end. She had passed through painful, shattering ecstasies of bliss, hours unforgettable, hours which she knew could never recur, and she was left sated and unsatisfied, so that by virtue of this not yet quite bitter disillusion, she was coming to regard herself as his superior, as being less naive than he, as being even essentially older than he. And in speaking to him sometimes she would put on a grave and precociously sapient mien, as if to indicate that she had access to sources of wisdom for ever closed to him. "But don't you think we ought to write?" She frowned. "Certainly, if you like. It won't do any good. You don't suppose our aunt will come down here, do you? And even if she did, there it is, and there you are." "Just let me wipe my shoulders, will you?" she said. He lifted his hands obediently, and as they were damp he rubbed them on the loose corner of the towel. "Well," he said, "I must be off, I reckon." "Shall you see Mr. Boutford?" "I might. I know where to catch him, I fancy." She seemed to have a glimpse of her husband's separate life in the town, masculine haunts and habits of which she knew nothing and would always know nothing, and the large existence of the male made her envious. "Going to see him now?" "Well, yes." George smiled roguishly. "What shall you say to him?" "What can I say to him? No business of mine, you know, except that we've lost a decent servant. But I expect that's Sarah's fault. She's no use whatever with servants now, Sarah isn't." "I shall never speak to Mr. Boutwood again," Hilda exclaimed almost passionately. "Oh, but—" "His behaviour is simply scandalous. It's really wicked, a man like him." George put his lips out deprecatingly. "You may depend she asked for it," he said. "What?" "She asked for it," he repeated with convinced firmness, and looked at her steadily. A flush slowly spread over her face and neck, and she lowered her gaze. In her breast pride and shame were again mingled. "You keep your hair on, little un," said George soothingly, and kissed her. Then he took his hat and stick, which were with a lot of other things on the broad white counterpane, and went off stylishly. "You don't understand," she threw at him with a delicious side glance of reproof as he opened the door. She reproached herself for the deceiving coquetry of the glance. "Don't I?" he returned airily. He was quite sure that nothing escaped his intelligence. To Hilda, shocked by the coarseness and the obtuseness which evidently characterized his attitude, now as on other occasions, this self-confidence was desolating. It was ominously sinister. 3. She was alone with her image in the mirror, and the image was precisely the same that she had always seen. She could detect no change in it whatever. She liked the sensation of being alone and at home in this room which before she had only ever entered as an overseer, and which she had never expected to occupy. She savoured the intimacy of the room, the necessaries on the washstand, the superb tortoiseshell brushes bought by George in Dublin on the dressing-table, the open trunks, George's clothes on a chair, and her own flimsy trifle on the bed. Through the glass she saw, behind her image, the image of the closed door, and then she turned round to look at the real door and to assure herself that it was closed. Childish. And yet George had shut the door. She remembered the noise of its shutting, and that noise in her memory seemed to have transformed itself into the sound of fate's deep bell. She could hear the clang, sharp, definite. She realized suddenly, and with awe, that her destiny was fixed hereafter. She had come to the end of her adventures and her vague dreams, for she had always dreamt vaguely of an enlarged liberty, of wide interests, and of original activities, such as no woman to her knowledge had ever had. She had always compared the life of men with the life of women, and admitted and resented the inferiority of the latter. She had had glimpses once of the male world. She had made herself the only woman shorthand writer in the Five Towns, and one of the earliest in England, Dizzy thought. But the glimpses had been vain and tantalizing. She had been in the male world, but not of it, as though encircled in a glass ball which neither she nor the males could shatter. She had had money, freedom, and ambition, and somehow, through ignorance or through lack of imagination or opportunity, had been unable to employ them. She had never known what she wanted. The vision had never been clear. And she reflected, "I wonder if my daughter, supposing I had one, would be as different from me as I am from my mother?" She could recall with intense vividness the moment when she had first really contemplated marriage. It was in the steam tram after having seen Edwin Clayhanger at the door of Clayhanger's shop, and she could recall the sense of relief with which she had envisaged a union with some man stronger and more experienced than herself. In the relief was a certain secret shame, as though it implied cowardice, a shrinking away from the challenge of life and from the call of a proud instinct. In the steam tram she had foreseen the time when she would belong utterly to some man, surrendering to him without reserve, the time when she would be a woman. And the thing had come about. Only yesterday she had been a little girl entering George Cannon's office with timid audacity to consult him. Only yesterday George Cannon had been a strange, formidable man, indefinitely older and infinitely cleverer than she. And now they were man and wife. Now she was his. Now she profoundly knew him, and he was no longer formidable, in spite of his force. She had a recondite dominion over him. She guessed herself to be his superior in certain qualities. He was revealed to her. She felt that she was not revealed to him, and that in spite of her whole-hearted surrender she had not given all because of his blindness to what she offered. She could not completely respect him, but she was his. She was naught apart from him. She was the wife. His existence went on mainly as before. Hers was diverted, narrowed, fundamentally altered. Never now could she be enfranchised into the male world. 4. She slipped her arms into a new bodice purchased in London on the second day of the marriage. Blushing, she had tried on that bodice in a great shop in Oxford Street. Then it was that she had first said, "My husband," in public. All that day she had felt so weak and shy and light and helpless and guilty that she had positively not known what she was doing. She moved in a phantom world. Only she had perceived quite steadily and practically that she must give more attention to her clothes. Her old contempt for finery expired in the glory of her new condition. And now, as she settled the elegant bodice on her shoulders, and fastened it, and patted her hair, and picked up the skirt, and poised it over her head, she had a stern, preoccupied look, as of one who said, "This that I am doing is important. I must not be hurried in doing it. It is vital that I should look well, and that no detail of my appearance should jar." Already she could see herself standing before George when he returned for the meal, the first meal which they would take together in the home. She could feel his eyes on her. She could anticipate her own mood, in which would be mingled pride, misgiving, pleasure, helplessness, abandonment, and the secret condescension towards him of her inmost soul. All alone in the room she could feel his hands again on her shoulders, a mysterious excitation. She was a married woman. She had the right to discuss Forrest's case with aloof disdain, if she chose. Her respectability was unassailable. None might penetrate beyond the fact of her marriage. And yet, far within her, she was ashamed. She dimly admitted once more, as on several occasions previous to her marriage, that she had dishonoured an ideal. Her conscience would not chime with the conscience of society. She thought, as she prepared with pleasurable expectancy for her husband, "This is not right. This cannot lead to good. It must lead to evil. I am bound to suffer for it. The whole thing is wrong. I know it, and I have always known it." Already she was disappointed with her marriage. Amid the fevers of bodily appetite she could clearly distinguish the beginnings of lassitude. She no longer saw her husband as a romantic and baffling figure. She had explored and charted his soul, and not all his excellencies could atone for his earthliness. She wondered grimly where and under what circumstances he had acquired the adroitness which had charmed, and still did charm her. She saw in front of her a vista of days and years in which ennui would probably increase and joy diminish. And she put her shoulders back defiantly and thought, "Well, here I am anyhow. I wanted him, and I've got him. What I have to go through, I shall go through." And all the time, floating like vapour over these depths, was a sheeny mood of bright expectation and immediate naive content. And she said gaily that she must write at once to Janet Orgreave to announce the marriage, and that her mother's uncle up in the north must also be informed. 5. Unusual phenomena made themselves apparent on the top staircase, raised voices, which Hilda could hear more and more plainly even through the shut door. At number 59 in the off-seasons nobody ever spoke in a loud tone, particularly on the staircase, except perhaps Florrie, when in conversation with Louisa she thought she was out of all other hearing. Hilda's voice was very clear and penetrating, but not loud. George Cannon's voice in public places such as the staircase had an almost caressing softness. The Watchets cooed like faint doves, thereby expressing the delicate refinement of their virginal natures. The cook's voice was unknown beyond the kitchen. And nobody was more grimly self-controlled in speech than Sarah Gailey and Louisa. These two, and especially Louisa, seemed generally to be restraining with ease tremendous secret forces of bitterness and contempt. And now it was just these two who were noisy, and becoming noisier, to the dismay of a scandalized house. Owing to some accident or negligence, the secret forces had got loose. Hilda shook her head. It was clear that the problem of Sarah Gailey would have to be tackled and settled very soon. The poor woman's physical sufferings had without doubt reacted detrimentally on her temperament and temper. She used to be quite extraordinarily adroit in the directing of servants, though her manner to them never approached geniality. But she had quarrelled with Florrie, and now she was breaking the peace with Louisa. It was preposterous and annoying, and it could not be allowed to continue. Hilda was not seriously alarmed, because she had the most perfect confidence in George's skill to restore order and calm, and to conquer every difficulty of management, and she also put a certain trust in herself. But the menacing and vicious accents of Louisa startled her, and she sympathized with Sarah Gailey, for whom humiliation was assuredly in store, if not immediately at the tongue of Louisa, then later, when George would have to hint the truth to her about her decadence. The dispute on the attic landing appeared to be concerning linen, which Louisa had omitted to remove from Florrie's abandoned couch in her kennel. "I ain't going to touch her seats, not for anybody," Louisa proclaimed savagely. And by that single phrase, with its implications, she laid unconsciously bare the sordid baseness of her ageing heart. She exposed by her mere intonation of the word sheets all the foulness of jealousy and thwarted salacity that was usually concealed beneath her tight dress and neat apron, and beneath her prim gestures and deferential tones. Her undisciplined voice rang spinsterishly down the staircase, outraging it, defiling the whole interior. Hilda, as silently as possible, unlatched the door of the bedroom and stood with ear cocked. Should she issue forth and interfere, or should she remain discreetly where she was? Almost in the same instant she heard the cautious unlatching of the drawing-room door. Two of the Watchets were there, listening also. And there came up from the ground floor a faint giggle. The cook at the kitchen door was enjoying herself and giggling moral support to her colleague. The giggle proved that the master was out, that the young mistress had not yet established a definite position, and that during recent weeks the old mistress must have been steadily dissipating her own authority. Hilda peered along the landing from her lair, and upstairs and downstairs. She could see nothing but senseless carpets and brass rods and steps and banisters. But she knew that the entire household, she had the sensation that the very house itself, was alert and eavesdropping. There was a hesitating movement on the unseen stairs above, and then Hilda could see Sarah Gailey's felt slippers and the valance of her skirt, and she could hear Sarah's emotional breathing. "Very well, Louisa, I've done." Sarah's voice was quieter now. She was trying to control it, and to a limited extent was controlling its volume. It shook in spite of her. She spoke true. She had indeed done. She was at the end of her resources. "I've been in houses," Louisa conqueringly sneered, "that I have. But I've never been in a house afore where one as ought to have been scullery girl went off with a boarder, and nothing said, and him the friend of the master. And it isn't as if that was all. Sheets, indeed!" "I've nothing further to say," Sarah returned unnecessarily, and descended the stairs. "I shall simply report to Mr. Cannon. We shall see." "And what's this about Mrs. Cannon?" Louisa shouted, beside herself. The peculiarity of her tone arrested Sarah gaily. Hilda flushed. The Watchets were listening. The Watchets had not yet been told of the marriage. The announcement was to be made to them formally a little later. And now it was Louisa who was making the announcement, brutally, coarsely. The outrage of the episode was 100-fold intensified. It grew into an inconceivable, ghastly horror. Hilda's self-respect seemed to have a physical body, and Louisa to be hacking at it with a jagged knife. "Mr. Cannon has brought his wife home," said Sarah gaily shortly, with a dignity and courage that increased as her distance from the appalling, the incredible Louisa. Hilda could see her pale face now. The eyebrows and chin were lifted in scorn of the vile menial, but the poor head was trembling. "And what about his other wife?" "Louisa!" Sarah gaily looked again up the stairs. "I know you're in a temper and not responsible for what you say, but you'd better be careful." She spoke with elaborate, haughty negligence. "Had I?" Louisa shrilled. "What I say is, what about his other wife? What about the old woman he married in Devonshire? Why, God bless me, Florrie was full of it. Couldn't talk about anything else in bed of a night. Don't you know the old woman's been inquiring for her beautiful husband down your way?" She laughed loudly. "Turnhill, what's his name? And of all you lying low and then making out all of a sudden as he's brought his wife home. A nice house, and I've been in a few too." Hilda could feel her heart beating with terrific force against her bodice, but she was conscious of no other sensation. She heard a loud snort of shattering contempt from Louisa, and then a strange and terrific silence fell on the stairs. There was no sound even of a movement. The Watchets did not stir, the cook did not stir, Sarah gaily did not stir. Louisa's fury was sated. The empty landing lay, as it were, expectant at Hilda's door. Then Sarah gaily perceived Hilda half hidden in the doorway, and staggeringly rushed towards her. In an instant they were both in the bedroom and the door shut. "When will George be back, so that he can put her out of the house?" Sarah whispered frantically. "Soon, I expect," said Hilda, and felt intensely self-conscious. They said no more, and it was as though the house were besieged and invested, and only in that room were they safe, and even in that room only for a few moments. End of Book 5, Chapter 1. Book 5, Chapter 2 of Hilda Lessways by Arnold BENNETT. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Book 5, Chapter 2, Some Secret History. 1. Without a word, Sarah had left the bedroom. Hilda waited, sitting on the bed, for George to come back from his haunts in the town. She both intensely desired and intensely feared his return. A phrase or two of an angry and vicious servant had almost destroyed her faith in her husband. It seemed very strange, even to her, that this should be so, and she wondered whether she had ever had a real faith in him, whether, passion apart, her feeling for him had ever been aught but admiration of his impressive adroitness. Was it possible that he had another wife alive? No, it was not possible. That is to say, it was not possible that such a catastrophe should have happened to just her, to Hilda Lessways, sitting there on the bed with her hands pressing on the rough surface of the damask counterpane. And yet, how could Louisa or Florrie have invented the story? Wicked, shocking, incredible, that Florrie, with her soft voice and timid affectionate manner, should have been chattering in secret so scandalously during these weeks. She remembered the look on Florrie's blushing face when the child had received the letter on the morning of their departure from the house in Lessways Street. Even then the attractively innocent and capable Florrie must have had her naughty secrets. An odious world, and Hilda, married, had seriously thought that she knew all about the world. she had to admit, bewildered. "I'm only a girl after all, and a very simple one." She compared her own heart in its simplicity with that of Louisa. Louisa horrified and frightened her. Louisa and Florrie were mischievous liars. Florrie had seized some fragment of silly gossip. Turnhill was notorious for its silly gossip, and the two of them had embroidered it in the nastiness of their souls. She laughed shortly, disdainfully, to wither up silly gossip. Preposterous! And yet, when George had shown her the licence in the name of Canon, and she ventured to say apologetically and caressingly, "I always understood your real name was Canonges," how queerly he looked at her as he answered, "I changed it long ago, legally." Yes, and she persuaded herself that the queerness of his look was only in her fancy. But it was not only in her fancy. Suspicions, sinister trifling souvenirs crowded into her mind. Had she not always doubted him? Had she not always said to herself that she was doing wrong in her marriage, and that she would thereby suffer? Had she not abandoned the pursuit of religious truth in favour of light enjoyments? Foolish, of course, old-fashioned, of course, to put two and two together in this way. But she could not refrain. "I am ruined," she decided, in awe. And the next instant she was saying, "How absurd of me to be like this, merely because Louisa—" She thought she heard a noise below. Her heart leapt again into violent activity. Trembling, she crept to the door and gently unlatched it. No slightest sound in the whole house. Dusk was coming on swiftly. Then she could hear all the noises, accentuated beyond custom, of Louisa setting tea in the dining-room for the Watchets. And then the tea-bell rang. Despite her fury, apparent in the noises, Louisa had not found courage to neglect the sacred borders. She made a defiant fuss, but she had to yield, intimidated, to the force of habit and tradition. The Watchets descended the staircase from the drawing-room, practising, as usual, elaborate small-talk among themselves. They had heard every infamous word of Louisa's tirade, which had engendered in them a truly dreadful and still delicious emotion, but they descended the staircase in good order, discussing the project for a new pier. They reached the dining-room and shut the door on themselves. Silence again. Louisa ought now to have set the tea in the basement parlour. But Louisa did not. Louisa was hidden in the kitchen, doubtless talking 14 to the dozen with the cook. She had done all she meant to do. She knew that she would be compelled to leave at once, and not another stroke would she do of any kind. The master and the mistresses must manage as best they could. Louisa was already wondering where she would sleep that night, for she was alone on earth and owned one small trunk and a post-office savings-bank book. All this trouble on account of Florrie's sheets. Sarah Gailey was in her bedroom, and did not dare to come out of it even to accuse Louisa of neglecting the basement tea. And Hilda continued to stand for ages at the bedroom door, while the dusk grew deeper and deeper. At last the front door opened, and George's step was in the hall. Hilda recognized it with a thrill of terror, turning pale. George ran down into the basement and stumbled. "Hello!" she heard him call out. "What about tea? Where are you all? Sarah?" No answer, no sound in response. He ran up the basement steps. Would he call in at the dining-room, or would he come to the bedroom in search of her? He did not stop at the dining-room. Hilda wanted to shut the bedroom door, but dared not, because she could not do it noiselessly. Now he was on the first floor. She rushed to the bed and sat on it, as she had been sitting previously, and waited in the most painful and irrational agony. She was astonished at the darkness of the room. Turning her head, she saw only a whitish blur instead of a face in the dressing-table mirror. 2. "What's up?" he demanded, bursting somewhat urgently into the bedroom with his hat on. "What price the husband coming home to his tea? No tea? No light? I nearly broke my neck down the basement stairs." He put his hands against her elbows and kissed her, rather clumsily, owing to the gloom between her nose and her mouth. She did not shrink back, but accepted the embrace quite insensibly. The contact of his moustache and of his lips, and his slight, pleasant, masculine odour, produced no effect on her whatever. "Why are you sitting here?" "Look here, I've signed the transfer of those Continental shares and paid the cheque, so it's domino now." Between the engagement and the marriage there had been the opportunity of purchasing £3,000 worth of preference shares in the Brighton Hotel Continental Limited, which hotel was the latest and largest in the King's Road, a vast affair of 8 stories, and bathrooms on every floor. The chance of such an investment had fascinated George. It helped his dreams, and pointed to the time when he would be manager and part proprietor of a palace like the Continental. Hilda being very willing, he had sold her railways shares and purchased the hotel shares, and he knew that he had done a good thing. Now he possessed an interest in 3 different establishments, he who had scarcely been in Brighton a year. The rapid progress, he felt, was characteristic of him. Hilda kept silent for the sole reason that she could think of no words to say. As for the matter of the investment, it appeared to her to be inexpressibly uninteresting. From under the lashes of lowered eyes she saw his form shadowly in front of her. "You don't mean to say Sarah's been making herself disagreeable already?" he said, and his tone was affectionate and diplomatic, yet faintly ironical. He had perceived that something unusual had occurred, perhaps something serious, and he was anxious to soothe and to justify his wife. Hilda perfectly understood his mood and intention, and she was reassured. "Hasn't Sarah told you?" she asked in a harsh, uncontrolled voice, though she knew that he had not seen Sarah. "No. Where is she?" he inquired patiently. "It's Louisa," Hilda went on, with the sick fright of a child compelled by intimidation to affront a danger. Her mouth was very dry. "Oh?" "She lost her temper and made a fearful scene with Sarah on the stairs. She said the most awful things." George laughed low and lightly. He guessed Louisa's gift for foul insolence in invective. "For instance?" George encouraged. He was divining from Hilda's singular tone that tact would be needed. "Well, she had said you'd got a wife living in Devonshire." There was a pause. "And who told her that?" "Florrie." "Indeed," muttered George. Hilda could not decide whether his voice was natural or forced. Then he stepped across to the door and opened it. "What are you going to do to her?" Hilda questioned, as it were despairingly. He left the room and banged the door. "It's not true," Hilda was beginning to say to herself, but she seemed to derive no pleasure from the dawning hope of George's innocence. Then George came into the room again, hesitated, and shut the door carefully. "I suppose it's no good shilly-shallying about," he said, in such a tone as he might have used had he been vexed and disgusted with Hilda. "I have got a wife living, and she's in Devonshire. I expect she's been inquiring in Turnhill if I'm still in the land of the living. Probably wants to get married again herself." Hilda glanced at his form, and suddenly it was the form of a stranger, but a stranger who had loved her. And she thought, "Why did I let this stranger love me?" It was scarce believable that she had ever seriously regarded him as a husband. And she found that tears were running down her cheeks, and she felt all her girlishness and fragility. "Didn't I always know," she asked herself with weak resignation, "that it was unreal? What am I to do now?" The catastrophe had indeed happened to her, and she could not deal with it. She did not even feel tragic. She did not feel particularly resentful against George. She had read of such catastrophes in the newspapers, but the reality of experience nonplussed her. "I ought to do something," she reflected, "but what?" "What's the use of me saying I'm sorry?" he asked savagely. "I acted for the best. The chances were 10,000 to 1 against me being spotted. But there you are, you never know your luck." He spoke meditatively, in a rather hoarse, indistinct voice. "All owing to Florrie, of course. When it was suggested we should have that girl, I knew there was a danger, but I pooh-poohed it. I said nothing could possibly happen. And just look at it now. I wanted to cut myself clear of the Five Towns, absolutely, absolutely. And then, like a damnation fool, I let Florrie come here. If she hadn't come, that woman might have inquired about me in Turnhill till all was blue without you hearing about her. But there it is." He snapped his fingers. "It's my fault for being found out. That's the only thing I'm guilty of. And look at it! Look at it!" Hilda could tell from the movements of the vague form in the corner by the door, and by the quality of his voice, that George Cannon was in a state of extreme emotion. She had never known him half so moved. His emotion excited her and flattered her. She thought how wonderful it was that she, the shaking little girl who yesterday had run off with fourpence to buy a meal at a tripe shop, should be the cause of this emotion in such a man. She thought, "My life is marvellous." She was dizzied by the conception of the capacity of her own body and soul for experience. No factors save her own body and soul and his had been necessary to the bringing about of the situation. It was essential only that the man and the woman should be together, and their companionship should produce miracles of experience. She ceased crying. Astounding that she had never, in George's eyes, suspected his past. It was as if he had swiftly opened a concealed door in the house of their passion, and disclosed a vista of which she had not dreamed. "But surely that must have been a long time ago," she said in an ordinary tone. "Considering that I was 22, yes." "Why did you leave her?" "Why did I leave her? Because I had to. I'd gone as a clerk in a solicitor's office in Torquay, and she was a client. She went mad about me. I'm only telling you. She was a spinster, had one of those big houses high up on the hill behind the town." He stopped, and then his voice began to come again out of the deep shadow in the corner. "She wanted me, and she got me, and she didn't care who knew. The wedding was in the Torquay Directory. I told her I'd got no relations, and she was jolly glad." "But how old was she? Young?" George sneered. "She'd never see 36 again the day she was married. Good looking, well dressed, very stylish and all that. Carried me off my feet. Of course there was the money. I may as well out with it all while I'm about it. She made me an absolute present of £4,000. Insisted on doing it. I never asked. Of course I know I married for money. It happens to youths sometimes, just as it does to girls. It may be disgusting, but not more disgusting for one than for the other. Besides, I didn't realize it was a sale and purchase at the time. Oh, and it lasted about 10 days. I couldn't stand it, so I told her so and chucked it. She began an action for restitution of conjugal rights, but she soon tired of that. She wouldn't have her 4,000 back, simply wouldn't. She was a terror, but I'll say that for her. Well, I kept it. £4,000 is a lot of brass. That's how I started business in Turnhill, if you want to know." He spoke defiantly. "You may depend I never let on in the Five Towns about my beautiful marriage. That's the tale. You've got to remember I was 22. She thought of Edwin Clayhanger and Charlie Orgreave as being about 22, and tried in her imagination to endow the mature George Cannon with their youth and their simplicity and their freshness. She was saddened and overawed, not wrathful, not obsessed by a sense of injury. Then she heard a sob in the corner, and then another. The moment was terrible for her. She could only distinguish in the room the blur of a man's shape against the light-coloured wallpaper, and the whiteness of the counterpane, and the dark square of the window broken by the black silhouette of the mirror. She slipped off the bed, and going in the direction of the dressing-table, groped for a matchbox and lit the gas. Dazzled by the glare of the gas, she turned to look at the corner where stood George Cannon. 3. The whole aspect of the room was now altered. The window was blacker than anything else. Light shone on the carved frame of the mirror and on the vessels of the washstand. The trunks each threw a sharply defined shadow. The bed was half in the shadow of its mahogany foot, and half a glittering white. All the array of requisites on the dressing-table lay stark under the close scrutiny of the gas, and, high above the bed, partly on the wall and partly on the ceiling, was a bright oblong reflection from the upturned mirror. Hilda turned to George with a straightening of the shoulders, as if to say, "It is I who have the courage to light the gas and face the situation." But when she saw him, her challenging pride seemed to die slowly away. Though there was no sign of a tear on his features, and though it was difficult to believe that it was he who had just sobbed, nevertheless his figure was dismayingly tragic. Every feature was distorted by agitation. He was absorbed in himself, shameless and careless of appearances. He was no more concerned about appearances and manly shame than a sufferer dying in torment. He was beyond all that, in truth a new George Cannon. He left the corner, and sat down on the bed in the hollow made by Hilda, and stared at the wall, his hands in the pockets of his gay suit. His gestures as he moved, and his posture as he sat, made their unconscious appeal to her in their abandonment. He was caught, he was vanquished, he was despairing. But he instinctively, and without any wish to do so, kept his dignity. He was still, in his complete overthrow, the mature man of the world, the man to whom it was impossible to be ridiculous. Hilda, in a curious way, grew proud of him. With an extraordinary inconsequence she dwelt upon the fact that, always grand, even as a caterer, he caused to be printed at the foot of the menu forms which he had instituted the words, "A second helping of all or any of the above dishes will be willingly be served if so desired." And in the general havoc of the shock she began to be proud also of herself, because it was the mysterious power of her individuality that had originated the disaster. The sense of their intimate, withdrawn seclusion in the room, disordered and littered by a rival, utterly alone save for the living flame of the gas, the sense of the tragedy, and of the responsibility for it, and especially her responsibility, the sense of an imposed burden to be grimly borne, and of an unknown destiny to be worked out, the sense of pity, the sense of youth and force. These things gradually exalted her, and ennobled her desolation. "Why did you keep it from me?" she asked, in a very clear and precise tone, not aggrieved, but fatalistic and melancholy. "Keep what from you?" At length he met her eyes darkly. "All this about your being married." "Why did I keep it from you?" he repeated harshly, and then his tone changed from defiance to a softened regret. "I'll tell you why I kept it from you. Because I knew if I told you I should have no chance with a girl like you. I knew it'd be all up, if I so much as breathed a hint of it. I don't suppose you've the slightest idea how standoffish you are." "Me standoffish?" she protested. "Look here," he said persuasively. "Supposing I'd told you I wanted you, and then that I got a wife living, what would you have said?" "I don't know." "No, but I know. And suppose I'd told you I got a wife living, and then told you I wanted you, what then? No, Hilda, nobody could fool about with you." She was flattered, but she thought secretly, "He could have won me on any terms he liked. I wonder whether he could have won me on any terms that first night in his house when we were in the front attic. Suppose he told me then? I wonder, what should I have said?" But the severity of her countenance was a perfect mask for such weak and uncertain ideas, and confirmed him deeply in his estimate of her. He continued, "Now that first night in this house, upstairs." He jerked his head towards the ceiling. She blushed, not from any shame, but because his thought had surprised hers. "I was near as damn it to letting out the whole thing and chancing it with you. But I didn't. I saw it would be no use. And that's not the only time either." She stood silent by the dressing-table, calmly looking at him, and she asked herself, eagerly curious, when were the other times? "Of course it's all my fault," he said. "What is?" "This, all my fault. I don't want to excuse myself. I've nothing to say for myself." In her mind she secretly interrupted him. "Yes, you have. You couldn't do without me. Isn't that enough?" "I'm ashamed," he said, without reserve, abasing himself. "I'm utterly ashamed. I'd give anything to be able to undo it." She was startled and offended. She had not expected that he would kiss the dust. She hated to see him thus. She thought, "It isn't all your fault. It's just as much mine as yours. But even if I was ashamed, I'd never confess it. Never would I grovel, and never would I want to undo anything. After all, you took the chances. You did what you thought best. Why be ashamed when things go wrong? You wouldn't have been ashamed if things had gone right." "Of course," he said after a pause, "I'm completely done for." He spoke so solemnly and with such intense conviction that she was awed and appalled. She felt as one who, having alone escaped destruction in an earthquake, stands afar off and contemplates the silent, corpse-strewn ruin of a vast city. And the thought ran through her mind like a squirrel through a tree. How could he refuse her £4,000? And if she wouldn't have it back, Well, what was he to do? She must be a horrible woman. 4. Both of them heard a heavy step pass up the staircase. It was Louisa's. She paused to strike a match and light the gas on the landing, and went on. But Sarah Gailey had given no sign, and the watches were still shut in the dining-room. All these middle-aged women were preoccupied by the affair of George Cannon. All of them guessed now that Louisa's charge was not unfounded. Otherwise, why the mysterious and interminable interview between George Cannon and Hilda in the bedroom? Hilda pictured them all, and he thought, but it is I who am in the bedroom with him. It is I who am living through it and facing it out. They are all far older than me, but they are outsiders. They don't know what life is. George rose, picked up a portmanteau, and threw it open on the bed. "And what is to be done?" Hilda asked, trembling. He turned and looked at her. "I suppose I mustn't stay here." She shook her head with lips pressed tight. His voice was thick and obscure when he asked, "You won't come with me?" She shook her head again. She could not have spoken. She was in acute torture. "Well," he said, "I suppose I can count on you not to give me up to the police." "The police?" she explained. "Why?" "Well, you know, it's a 3 years' job at least. Ever heard the word bigamy?" His voice was slightly ironical. "Oh dear!" she breathed, already disconcerted. It had positively not occurred to her to consider the legal aspect of George's conduct. "But what can you do?" she asked, with the innocent, ignorant helplessness of a girl. "I can disappear," he replied. "That's all I can do. I don't see myself in prison. I went over to Stafford prison once. The governor showed several of us over. And I don't see myself in prison." He began to cast things into the portmanteau, and as he did so he proceeded, without a single glance at Hilda. "You'll be all right for money and so on, but I should advise you to leave here, and not to come back any sooner than you can help. That's the best thing you can do. And be Hilda Lessways again. Sarah will have to manage this place as best she can. Fortunately her health's improved. She can make it play very well if she likes. It's a handsome living for her. My deposit on the Chichester and so on will have to be forfeited." "And you?" she murmured. His back was towards her. He turned his head, looked at her enigmatically for an instant, and resumed his packing. She desired to help him with the packing. She desired to show him some tenderness. Her heart was cleft in two with pity. But she could not move. Some harshness of pride or vanity prevented her from moving. When he had carelessly finished the portmanteau, he strode to the door, opened it wide, and called out in a loud, firm voice, "Louisa!" A reply came weakly from the top floor. "Yes, sir?" "I want you." He had a short way with Louisa. After a brief delay she came to the bedroom door. "Run down to the King's Road and get me a cab," he said to her at the door, as it were confidentially. "Yes, sir." The woman was like a Christian slave. "Here, take the portmanteau down with you to the front door." He gave her the portmanteau. "Yes, sir." She disappeared, and then there was the noise of the front door opening. George picked up his hat and abruptly left the room. Hilda moved to and fro nervously, stiff with having stood still so long. She wondered how he and how she would comport themselves in the ordeal of adieu. In a few moments a cab drove up. Louisa had probably encountered it on the way. Hilda waited, tense. Then she heard the cab driving off again. She rushed, aghast, to the window. She saw the roof of the disappearing cab, and the unwieldy portmanteau on it. He had gone. He had gone without saying good-bye. That was his device for simplifying the situation. It was drastic, but it was magnificent. He had gone out of the house and out of her life. As she gazed at the dim, swaying roof of the cab, magically the roof was taken off, and she could see the ravaged and stricken figure within, sitting grimly in the dark between the wheels that rolled him away from her. The vision was intolerable. She moved aside and wept passionately. How could he help doing all he had done? She had possessed him. The memories of his embrace told her how utterly. All that he had said was true, and this being so, who could blame his conduct? He had only risked and lost. Sarah Gailey suddenly appeared in the room and shut the door like a conspirator. "Then," she began, terror-struck, and Hilda nodded, ceasing to cry. "Oh, my poor dear!" Sarah Gailey moaned feebly, her head bobbing with its unconscious nervous movements. The sight of her worn, saddened features sharpened Hilda's appreciation of her own girlishness and inexperience. But despite the shock, despite her extreme misery, despite the anguish and fear in her heart, and the immense difficulty of the new situation into which she was thus violently thrust, Hilda was not without consolation. She felt none of the shame conventionally proper to a girl deceived. On the contrary, deep within herself she knew that the catastrophe was a deliverance. She knew that fate had favoured her by absolving her from the consequences of a tragic weakness and error. These thoughts inflamed and rendered more beautiful the apprehensive pity for the real victim, now affronted by a new danger, the menace of the law. End of Book 5, Chapter 2. Book 6, Chapter 1 of Hilda Lessways by Arnold BENNETT. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Book 6, Her Punishment. Chapter 1, Evening at Bleakridge. 1. When Hilda's cab turned, perilously swaying, through the gate into the dark garden of the Orgreaves, Hilda saw another cab already at the open house door, and in the lighted porch stood figures distinguishable as Janet and Alicia, all enwrapped for a journey, and Martha holding more wraps. The long façade of the house was black, save for one window on the first floor, which threw a faint radiance on the leafless branches of elms, and thus intensified the upper mysteries of the nocturnal garden. The arrival of the second cab caused excitement in the porch, and Hilda, leaning out of the window into the November mist, shook with apprehension as her vehicle came to a halt behind the other one. She was now to meet friends for the first time after her secret and unhappy adventure. She feared that Janet, by some magic insight of affection, would read at once in her face the whole history of the past year. Janet had written to her, giving and asking for news and urging a visit, on the very day after the scene in which George Cannon admitted his turpitude. Had the letter been sent a day or two sooner, reaching Hilda on her honeymoon, she would certainly have replied to it with the tremendous news of her marriage, and her marriage having been made public in the Five Towns, her shame also would necessarily be public. But chance had saved her from this humiliation. Nobody in the district was aware of the marriage. By a characteristic instinct she had determined not to announce it in any way until the honeymoon was over. In answer to Janet she had written very briefly, as was usual with her, and said that she would come to Lane End House as soon as she could. "Shall I tell her or shan't I?" she had cogitated, and the decision had been for postponement. But she strongly desired, nevertheless, to pay the visit. She had had more than enough of Preston Street and of Brighton, and longed to leave at any price. And at length, one dull morning, after George Cannon had sailed for America, and all affairs were somehow arranged, or had arranged themselves, and Sarah Gailey was better, and the autumn season smoothly running with new servants, she had suddenly said to Sarah, "I have to go to Bursty to-day for a few days," and she had gone upon the impasse without having previously warned Janet. Changing at Knype, she had got into the wrong train, and had found herself at Shawport, at the far lower end of Bursley, instead of up at Bleakridge, close by the Orgreaves. And there was, of course, no cab for her. But a cabman who had brought a fare to the station and was driving his young woman back had offered in a friendly way to take Hilda too. And she had sat in the cab with the young woman who was a paintress at Peel's great manufactory at Shawport, and suffered from a weak chest, and they talked about the potters' strike, which was then upheaving the district, and the cab had overtaken a procession of thinly clad potters wending in the bitter mist to a mass meeting at Hambridge, and Hilda had been thereby much impressed and angered against all employers. and the young woman had left the cab half-way up Trafalgar Road, with a delicious pink and white smile of adieu. And Hilda had thought how different all this was from Brighton, and how much better and more homely and understandable. And now she was in the garden of the Orgreaves. Martha came peeping to discover the explanation of this singular concourse of cabs in the garden, and she cried joyously, "Oh, Miss Janet, it's Miss Hilda, Miss Lessways, I mean." Alicia shrieked. The first cab drew forward to make room for Hilda's, and Hilda stepped down into the glare of the porch and was plainly beheld by all three girls. "Will they notice anything?" she asked herself, self-conscious, almost trembling, as she thought of the terrific changes that had passed in her since her previous visit. But nobody noticed anything. Nobody observed that this was not the same Hilda. Even in the intimacy of the affectionate kiss for which she had lifted her veil, Janet seemed to have no suspicion whatever. "We were just off to Hillport," said Janet. "How splendid of you to come like this!" "Don't let's go to Hillport," said Alicia. Janet hesitated, pulling down her veil. "Of course you must go," Hilda said positively. "I'm afraid we shall have to go," said Janet with reluctance. "You see, it's the Marions, Edie's cousins, and Edie will be there." "Who's Edie?" "Why, Tom's fiancée. Surely I told you." "Yes," said Hilda, "only I didn't just remember the name. How nice!" She thought, "No sooner do I get here than I talk like they do. Fancy me saying, 'How nice!'" "Oh, it's all Edie nowadays," said Alicia lightly. "We have to be frightfully particular, or else Tom would cut our heads off. That's why we're going in a cab. We should have walked, shouldn't we, Janet? And it would never do for us to walk to the Marions at night. The Mrs. Lessways carriage," she mimicked, and finicked about on her toes. Janet was precisely the same as ever, but the pig-tailed Alicia had developed. Her childishness was now shot through with gestures and tones of the young girl. She flushed and paled continuously, and was acutely self-conscious and somewhat vain, but not offensively vain. "I say, Jan," she exclaimed, "why shouldn't Hilda come with us?" "To the Marions? Oh, no, thanks," said Hilda. "But do, Hilda, I'm sure they'd be delighted," Janet urged. "I never thought of it." Though she was flattered, and indeed a little startled by the extraordinary seriousness of Janet's insistence, Hilda shook her head. "Where's Tom?" she inquired, to change the subject. "Oh," Alicia burst out again, "he's gone off hours ago to escort his lady love from Hanbridge to Hillport." "You wait till you're engaged, Alicia," Janet suggested. But Janet's eyes too twinkled the admission that Tom was just then providing much innocent amusement to the family. "You'll sleep in my room to-night, anyhow, dear," said Janet, when Martha and Hilda's cabman had brought a trunk into the hall, and Hilda had paid the cabman far more than his fare, because he was such a friendly young cabman, and because he possessed a pulmonary sweetheart. "Come along, dear. Alicia, ask Swindles to wait a moment or two." "Swindles!" Alicia shouted to the original cabman. "Just wait a jiff." "Yes, miss." The original cabman, being old and accustomed to evening party work in the Five Towns, knew the length of a jiff, and got down from his seat to exercise both arms and legs. With sardonic pleasure he watched the young cabman cut a black streak in the sodden lawn with his near front wheel as he clumsily turned to leave. Then Martha banged the front door, and another servant appeared in the hall to help the trunk on its way upstairs. "No, I shall never be able to tell them," thought Hilda, following the trunk. Alicia had scampered on in front of the trunk to inform her parents of the arrival. Mrs. Orgreave, Hilda learnt, was laid up with an attack of asthma, and Osmond Orgreave was working in their bedroom. 2. Hilda stood in front of the fire in Janet's bedroom, and Janet was unlocking her trunk. "Why, what a pretty bodice!" said Janet, opening the trunk. She stood up and held forth the bodice to inspect it, and beneath Janet's cloak Hilda could see the splendour of her evening dress. "Where did you get it?" "In London," Hilda was about to answer, but she took thought. "Oh, Brighton?" It was a lie. She had a longing to say, "No, not Brighton. What am I thinking of? I got it in London on my honeymoon." What a unique sensation that one word would have caused! But she could not find courage to utter it. Alicia came importantly in. "Mother's love, and you are to go into her room as soon as you're ready. Martha will bring up a tray for you, and you'll eat there by the fire. It's all arranged." "And what about father's love?" Hilda demanded with a sprightliness that astonished herself. And she thought, "Why are these people so fond of me? They don't even ask how it was I didn't write to tell them I was coming. They just accept me and welcome me without questions. No, I can never tell them. It simply couldn't be told here. If they find out, so much the worse." "You must ask him," Alicia answered, blushing. "All right, Alicia, we'll be ready in a minute or two," said Janet in a peculiar voice. It was a gentle command to Alicia to leave her elders alone to their adult confidences, and unwilling Alicia had to obey. But there were no confidences. The talk, as it were, shivered on the brink of a confidence, but never plunged. "Does she guess?" Hilda reflected. The conversation so halted that at length Janet was driven to the banality of saying, "I'm so sorry we have to go out." And Hilda protested with equal banality, and added, "I suppose you're going out a lot just now?" "Oh no," said Janet, "we go out less and less, and we get quieter and quieter. I mean us. The boys are always out, you know." She seemed saddened. "I think Edwin Clayhanger would come in sometimes, now they're living next door." "They're in their new house, then?" said Hilda with casualness. "Oh, long ago, and I'm sure it's ages since he was here. I like Maggie, his sister." Hilda knelt to her trunk. "Did he ever inquire after me?" she demanded, with an air of archness, but hiding her face. "As a matter of fact, he did, once," said Janet, imitating Hilda's manner. "Well, that's something," said Hilda. There was a sharp knock at the door. "Hot water, miss!" cried the voice of Martha. The next instant Martha was arranging the ewer and the can and some clean towels on the washstand. Her face was full of joy in the unexpected arrival. She was as excited as if Hilda had been her own friend instead of Janet's. "Well, dear, shall you be all right now?" said Janet. "Perhaps I ought to be going. You may depend on it I shall get back as early as ever I can." The two girls kissed with even more freedom than in the hall. It seemed astonishing to Hilda, as her face was close to Janet's, that Janet did not exclaim, "Something has happened to you. What is it? You are not as you used to be. You are not like me." She felt herself an impostor. "Why should I tell?" Hilda reflected. "What end would it serve? It's nobody's business but mine. He is gone. He'll never come back. Everything's over. And if it does get about, well, they'll only praise me for my discretion. They can't do anything else." Still, she longed timorously to confide in Janet. And when Janet had departed, she breathed relief, because the danger of confiding in Janet was withdrawn for the moment. 3. Later, as the invalid had ordained, Hilda, having eaten, sat by the fire in the large, quiet bedroom of Mr. and Mrs. Orgreave. The latter was enjoying a period of ease, and lay, with head raised very high on pillows, in her own half of the broad bed. The quilt extended over her without a crease in its expanse. The sheet was turned down with precision, making a level white border to the quilt, and Mrs. Orgreave did not stir. Not one of her grey locks stirred. She spoke occasionally in a low voice. On the night table stood a Godfrey's chloride of ammonia inhaler, with its glass cylinder and triple arrangement of tubes. There was only this, and the dark lips and pale cheeks of the patient, to remind the beholder that not long since the bed had been a scene of agony. Mr. Orgreave, in bright carpet slippers and elegant wristbands blossoming out of the sleeves of his black house jacket, stood bending above a huge board that was laid horizontally on trestles to the left of the fireplace. This board was covered by a wide length of bluish transparent paper, which at intervals he pulled towards him, making billows of paper at his feet and gradually lessening a roll of it that lay on the floor beyond the table. A specially arranged gas bracket with a green shade, which threw a powerful light on the paper, showed that Osmond Orgreave's habit was to work in that spot of an evening. "Astonishing I have to do this myself, isn't it?" he observed, stooping to roll up the accumulated length of paper about his feet. "What is it?" Hilda asked. "It's a full-size detail drawing. Simple. But do you suppose I could trust either of my ingenious sons to get the curves of the mouldings right?" "You'll never be able to trust them unless you begin to trust them," said Mrs. Orgreave sagely from the bed. "Ha!" ejaculated Osmond Orgreave satirically. This remark was one of his most effective counters to argument. The fact is, he thoroughly enjoys it, doesn't he, Mrs. Orgreave? Said Hilda. You're quite right, my dear, said Mrs. Orgreave. Ah, from Mr. Orgreave. He sketched with a pencil and rubbed out vigorously. Then his eye caught Hilda's, and they both smiled, very content. They'd look nice if I took to drink instead of to work for a change, he murmured, pausing to caress his handsome hair. There was a sharp knock at the door, and into this room also the watchful Martha entered. Here's the signal, sir. The boy's only just brought it. Give it to Mr. Hilda, said Mr. Orgreave, without glancing up. Shall I take the tray away, Martha inquired, looking towards the bed, the supreme centre of domestic order and authority. Perhaps Miss Hilda hasn't finished. Oh, yes, I have, thanks. Martha rearranged the vessels and cutlery upon the tray with quick, expert movements of the wrists. Her gaze was carefully fixed on the tray. Endowed though she was with rare privileges as a faithful retainer, she would have been shocked and shamed had her gaze, improperly wandering, encountered the gaze of the master or the guest. Then she picked up the tray, and pushing the small table into its accustomed place with a deft twist of the foot, she sailed, erect and prim, out of the room, and the door primly clicked on her neat girded waist and flying white ribbons. "And what am I to do with this signal?" Hilda asked, fingering the white, damp paper. "I should like you to read us about the strike," said Mrs. Orgreave. "It's a dreadful thing." "I should think it was," Hilda agreed fervently. "Oh, do you know, on the way from Shawport I saw a procession of the men, and anything more terrible." "It's the children I think of," said Mrs. Orgreave softly. "Pity the men don't," Mr. Orgreave murmured without raising his head. "Don't what?" Hilda asked defiantly. "Think of the children." Bridling, but silent, Hilda opened the sheet and searched round and about its columns with the embarrassed bewilderment of one unaccustomed to the perusal of newspapers. "Look on page 3, first column," said Mr. Orgreave. "That's all about racing," said Hilda. "Oh, dear, dear," from the bed. "Well, second column." "The Potters' Strike, the men's leaders," she read the headlines. "There isn't much of it." "How beautifully clearly you read," said Mrs. Orgreave, with mild enthusiasm, when Hilda had read the meagre half-column. "Do I?" Hilda flushed. "Is that all there is about it?" "Yes, they don't seem to think it's very important that half the people are starving," Hilda sneered. "Whose fault is it they do starve?" Osmond Orgreave glanced at her with lowered head. "I think it's a shame," she exclaimed. "Do you know that the men broke the last award not so very long since?" said Osmond Orgreave. "What can you do with such people?" "Broke the last award?" She was checked. "Broke the last award. Wouldn't stick by their own agreement, their own words. I'll just tell you, a wise young woman like you oughtn't to be carried away by the sight of a procession on a cold night." He smiled, and she smiled, but awkwardly. And then he told her something of the case for the employers. "How hard you are on the men," she protested when he had done. "Not at all, not at all." He stretched himself and came round his trestles to poke the fire. "You should hear Mr. Clayhanger on the men if you want to know what hard is." "Mr. Clayhanger? You mean old Mr. Clayhanger?" "Yes." "But he isn't a manufacturer." "No, but he's an employer of labour." Hilda rose uneasily from her chair and walked towards the distant, shadowed dressing-table. "I should like to go over a printing works," she said abruptly. "Very easy," said Mr. Orgreave, resuming his work with a great expulsion of breath. Hilda thought, "Why did I say that?" And to cover her constraint she cried out, "Oh, what a lovely book!" A small book, bound in full purple calf, lay half hidden in a nest of fine tissue paper on the dressing-table. "Yes, isn't it?" said Mrs. Orgreave. "Tom brought it in to show me before he went this afternoon. It's a birthday present for Edie. He's had it specially browned. I must write myself and ask Edie to come over and meet you. I'm sure you'd like her. She's a dear girl. I think Tom's very fortunate." "No, you don't," Osmond Orgreave contradicted her with a great rustling of paper. "You think Edie's very fortunate." Hilda looked round and caught the architect's smile. "I think they're both fortunate," said Mrs. Orgreave simply. She had almost no sense of humour. "I'm sure she's a real good girl, and clever too." "Clever enough to get on the right side of her future mother-in-law, anyway," growled Mr. Orgreave. "Anyone might think Osmond didn't like the girl," said Mrs. Orgreave, "from the way he talks, and yet he adores her, and it's no use him pretending he doesn't." "I only adore you," said Osmond. "You needn't try to turn it off," his wife murmured, beaming on Hilda. Tears came strangely into Hilda's eyes, and she turned again to the dressing-table. And through a blur she saw all the objects ranged in a long row on the white cloth that covered the rosewood, and she thought, "All this is beautiful." And she saw the pale blinds drawn down behind the dressing-table, and the valance at the top, and the draped curtains, and herself darkly in the glass. And she could feel the vista of the large, calm, comfortable room behind her, and could hear the coals falling together in the grate, and the rustling of the architect's paper, and Mrs. Orgreave's slight cough. And in her mind she could see all the other rooms in the spacious house, and the dim, misted garden beyond. She thought, "All this house is beautiful. It is the most beautiful thing I've ever known, or ever shall know. I'm happy here." And then her imagination followed each of the children. She imagined Marion, the eldest, and her babies in London, and Charlie also in London, practising medicine, and Tom and Janet and Alicia at the party at Hillport, and Jimmy and Johnny seeing life at Hambridge, while the parents remained in tranquillity in their bedroom. All these visions were beautiful. Even the vision of Jimmy and Johnny flourishing billiard cues and glasses and pipes in the smoky atmosphere of a club. Even this was beautiful. It was as simply touching as the other visions. And she was at home with the parents, and so extremely intimate with them that she could nearly conceive herself a genuine member of the house. She was in bliss. Her immediate past dropped away from her like an illusion, and she became almost the old Hilda. She was almost born again into innocence. Only the tragic figure of George Cannon hung vague in the far distance of memory, and the sight thereof constricted her heart. Utterly her passion for him had expired. She was exquisitely sad for him. She felt towards him kindly and guiltily, as one feels towards an old error. And withal the spell of the home of the Orgreaves took away his reality. She was fingering the book. Its title page ran, "The English Poems of Richard Crashaw." Now she had never even heard of Richard Crashaw, and she wondered who he might be. Turning the pages, she read, "All thy old woes shall now smile on thee, and thy pains sit bright upon thee. All thy sorrows here shall shine, all thy sufferings be divine. Tears shall take comfort and turn gems, and wrongs repent to diadems." And she read again, as though the words had been too lovely to be real, and she must reassure herself of them. Tears shall take comfort and turn gems, and wrongs repent to diadems. She turned back to the beginning of the poem and read the title of it. "A hymn to the name and honour of the admirable St. Teresa, foundress of the Reformation of the discalced Carmelites, both men and women. A woman for angelical height of speculation, for masculine courage of performance more than a woman, who, yet a child, outran maturity, and durst plot a martyrdom." The prose thrilled her even more intimately than the verse. She cried within herself, "Why have I never heard of Richard Crashaw? Why did Tom never tell me?" She became upon the instant a devotee of this Saint Teresa. She thought inconsequently, with a pang that was also a reassurance, George Cannon would never have understood this, but everyone here understands it. And with hands enfevered she turned the pages again, and after several disappointments read, "O thou undaunted daughter of desires, by all thy dower of lights and fires, by all the eagle in thee, all the dove, by all thy lives and deaths of love, by thy large draughts of intellectual day, and by thy thirsts of love more large than they, by all thy brim-filled bowls of fierce desire, by this last morning's draught of liquid fire, by the full kingdom of that final kiss." She ceased to read. It was as if her soul was crying out, "I also am Teresa. This is I. This is I." Then the door opened, and Martha appeared once more. "If you please, sir, Mr. Edwin Clayhanger's called." "Oh, well, I've nearly finished. Where is he?" "In the breakfast-room, sir." Well, tell him I'll be down in a minute."
"Hilda," said Mrs. Orgreave, "would you mind going and telling him?" Hilda had replaced the book in its nest and gone quickly back to her chair. The entrance of the servant at that moment to announce Edwin Clayhanger seemed to her startlingly dramatic. "What?" she thought. "I am just reading that, and he comes. He hasn't been here for ages, and on the very night that I come, he comes." "Certainly," she replied to Mrs. Orgreave, and she thought, "This is the second time she sent me with a message to Edwin Clayhanger." Suddenly she blushed in confusion before the mistress of the home. "Is it possible," she asked herself, "is it possible that Mrs. Orgreave doesn't guess what has happened to me? Is it possible she can't see that I'm different from what I used to be? If she knew, if they knew, here—" She left the room like a criminal. When she was going down the stairs she discovered that she held the signal in her hand. She had no recollection of picking it up, and there was no object in taking it to the breakfast-room. She thought, "What a state I must be in!"
End of Book 6, Chapter 1. Book 6, Chapter 2 of Hilda Lessways by Arnold BENNETT. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Book 6, Chapter 2, A Rendezvous. 1. "I suppose you've never thought about me once since I've left." She was sitting on the sofa in the small shelved breakfast-room, and she shot these words at Edwin Clayhanger, who was standing near her. The singular words were certainly uttered out of bravado. They were a challenge to adventure. She thought, "It is madness for me to say such a thing." But such a thing had nevertheless come quite glibly out of her mouth, and she knew not why. If Edwin Clayhanger was startled, so was she startled. "Oh, yes, I have," he stammered. Of course she had put him out of countenance. She smiled and said persuasively, "But you've never inquired after me." "Yes, I have," he answered, with a hint of defiance, after a pause. "Only once," she continued to smile. "How do you know?" he demanded. Then she told him very calmly, extinguishing the smile, that her source of information was Janet. "That's nothing to go by," he exclaimed with sudden roughness. "That's nothing to go by, the number of times I've inquired." 2. She was silenced. She thought, "If I am thus intimate with him, it must be because of the talk we had in the garden that night." And it seemed to her that the scene in the garden had somehow bound them together for ever in intimacy, that, even if they pretended to be only acquaintances, they would constantly be breaking through the thin shell of formality into some unguessed deep of intimacy. She regarded, surreptitiously, his face with a keen sense of pleasure. It was romantic, melancholy, wistful, enigmatic, and above all, honest. She knew that he had desired to be an architect, and that his father had thwarted his desire, and this fact endowed him for her with the charm of a victim. The idea that all his life had been embittered and shadowed by the caprice of an old man was beautiful to her in its sadness. She contemplated it with vague bliss. At their last meeting, during the Sunday School centenary, he had annoyed her. He had even drawn her disdain by his lack of initiative and male force in the incident of the senile Sunday School teacher. He had profoundly disappointed her. Now she simply forgot this. The sinister impression vanished from her mind. She recalled her first vision of him in the lighted doorway of his father's shop. Her present vision confirmed that sympathetic vision. She liked the feel of his faithful hand and the glance of his timid and yet bellicose eye. And she reposed on his very apparent honesty as on a bed. She knew, with the assurance of perfect faith, that he had nothing dubious to conceal, and that no test could strain his magnanimity. And, while she so reflected, she was thinking, too, of Janet's fine dress, and her elegance and jewels, and wishing that she had changed the old black frock in which she travelled. The perception that she could never be like Janet cast her down. But the next moment she was saying to herself proudly, "What does it matter? Why should I be like Janet?" And the next moment after that she was saying in another phase of her pride, "I will be like Janet." They began to discuss the strike. It was a topic which, during those weeks, could not be avoided either by the rich or by the poor.
I suppose you're like all the rest, against the men?" she challenged him again, inviting battle. He replied bluntly, "What earthly right have you to suppose that I'm like all the rest?" She bent her head lower so that she could only see him through the veil of her eyelashes. "I'm very sorry," she said in a low, smiling, meditative voice. "I knew all the time you weren't." The thought shot through her mind like a lance. "It is incredible and horribly dangerous that I should be sitting here with him after all that has happened to me, and him without the slightest suspicion. And yet what can stop it from coming out sooner or later? Nothing can stop it." Edwin Clayhanger continued to talk of the strike, and she heard him saying, "If you ask me, I'll tell you what I think. Workmen on strike are always in the right. You've only got to look at them in a crowd together. They don't starve themselves for fun." What he said thrilled her. There was nothing in it, but there was everything in it. His generosity towards the oppressed was everything to her. His whole attitude was utterly and mysteriously different from that of any other man whom she had known. And with that simple, wistful expression of his. They went on talking, and then, following in secret the train of her own thoughts, she suddenly burst out, "I never met anybody like you before." A pause ensued. "No, never," she added with intense conviction. "I might say the same of you," he replied, moved. "Oh, no, I'm nothing," she breathed. She glanced up, exquisitely flattered. His face was crimson. Exquisite moment in the familiarity of the breakfast-room, by the fire, she on the sofa, with him standing over her, a delicious peril. The crimson slowly paled. 3. Osmond Orgreave entered the room, quizzical, and at once began to tease Clayhanger about the infrequency of his visits. Turning to Hilda, he said, "He scarcely ever comes to see us except when you're here." It was just as if he had said, "I heard every word you spoke before I came in, and I've read your hearts." Both Hilda and Clayhanger were disconcerted, Clayhanger extremely so. "Steady on," he protested uncouthly, and then with a most naive ingenuousness, "Mrs. Orgreave better?" But Osmond Orgreave was not in a merciful mood. A moment later he was saying, "Has she told you she wants to go over her printing works?" "No," Clayhanger answered with interest, "but I shall be very pleased to show her over ours any time." Hilda, struck into silence, made no response, and instantly Clayhanger finished in another tone, "Look here, I must be off. I only slipped in for a minute, really." And he went, declining Mr. Orgreave's request to give a date for his next call. The bang of the front door resounded through the house. Mr. Orgreave, having taken Clayhanger to the front door, did not return immediately into the breakfast-room. Hilda jumped up from the sofa, hesitant. She was disappointed. She was even resentful. Assuredly she was humiliated. "Oh, no," she thought, "he's weak and afraid. I dare say he went off because Janet wasn't here." She heard through the half-open door Mr. Orgreave's slippers on the tiles of the passage leading to the stairs. Martha came into the room with a delighted, curious smile. "If you please, miss, could you come into the hall a minute? Someone to speak to you." Hilda blushed silently, and obeyed. Clayhanger was standing in the chill hall, hat in hand. Her heart jumped. "When will you come to look over our works?" he muttered rapidly and very nervously, and yet with a dictatorial gruffness. "Tomorrow? I should like you to come." He put an enchantment upon her by this marvellous return, and to conceal from him what he had done, she frowned and kept silent. "What time?" she asked suddenly. "Any time." His eagerness was thrilling. "Oh, no, you must fix the time. Say between 6:30 and 7:15, that do?" She nodded. Their hands met. He said adieu. He pulled open the heavy door. She saw his back for an instant against the pale gloom of the garden in which vapour was curling. And then she had shut the door and was standing alone in the confined hall. A miracle had occurred, and it intimidated her. And, amid her wondrous fears, she was steeped in the unique sense of adventure. "This morning I was in Brighton," she thought. "Half an hour ago I had no notion of seeing him. And now? And tomorrow?" The tragic sequel to one adventure had not impaired her instinct for experience. On the contrary, it had strengthened it, The very failure of the one excited her towards another. The zest of living was reborn in her. The morrow beckoned her, golden and miraculous. The faculty of men and women to create their own lives seemed divine, and the conception of it enfevered her. End of Book 6, Chapter 2. Book 6, Chapter 3 of Hilda Lessways by Arnold BENNETT. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Book 6, Chapter 3, At the Works. 1. That night, late, Hilda and Janet shut themselves up in the bedroom together. The door clicked softly under Janet's gentle push, and they were as safe from invitation as if the door had been of iron, and locked and double-locked and barred with bars of iron. Alicia alone might have disturbed them, but Alicia was asleep. Hilda had a sense of entire security in this room, such as she had never had since she drove away from Lessways Street, Turnhill, early one morning with Florrie Bagster in a cab. It was not that there had been the least real fear of any room of hers being attacked. It was that this room seemed to have been rendered mystically inviolate by long years of Janet's occupancy. Janet's bedroom. The phrase had a sanction which could not possibly have attached itself to, for instance, Hilda's bedroom, nor even to Mother's bedroom. Mother's bedroom being indeed at the mercy of any profane and marauding member of the family, a sort of market-place for the transaction of affairs. And further, Janet's bedroom was distinguished and made delicious for Hilda by its fire. It happened to be one of the very few bedrooms in the Five Towns at that date with a fire as a regular feature of it. Mrs. Orgreave had a fire in the parental bedroom, when she could not reasonably do without it, but Osmond Orgreave suffered the fire rather than enjoyed it. As for Tom, though of a shivery disposition, he would have dithered to death before admitting that a bedroom fire might increase his comfort. Johnny and Jimmy genuinely liked to be cold in their bedroom. Alicia pined for a fire, but Mrs. Orgreave, imitating the contrariety of fate, forbade a fire to Alicia, and one consequence of this was that Alicia sometimes undressed in Janet's bedroom, making afterwards a dash for the pole. The idea of a bedroom was always, during nearly half the year, associated with the idea of discomfort in Hilda's mind. And now, in Janet's bedroom, impressed as she was by the strangeness of the fact that the prime reason for hurrying at top speed into bed had been abolished, she yet positively could not linger, the force of habit being too strong for her. And she was in bed, despite efforts to dawdle, while Janet was still brushing her hair. As she lay and watched Janet's complex unrobing, she acquired knowledge, and once more she found herself desiring to be like Janet, not only in appearance, but in soft manner and tone. She thought, "How shall I dress tomorrow afternoon?" All the operations of her brain related themselves somehow to tomorrow afternoon. The anticipation of the visit to the printing works burned in her heart like a steady lamp that shone through the brief, cloudy interests of the moment. And Edwin Clayhanger was precisely the topic which Janet seemed, as it were, expressly to avoid. Janet inquired concerning life at Brighton and the health of Sarah Gailey. Janet even mentioned George Cannon. Hilda steadied her voice in replying, though she was not really apprehensive, for Janet's questions, like the questions of the whole family, were invariably discreet and respectful of the individual's privacy. But of Edwin Clayhanger, whose visit nevertheless had been recounted to her in the drawing-room on her return, Janet said not a word. And then, when she had extinguished the gas, and the oriental sleeve of her silk nightgown delicately brushed Hilda's face as she got into bed, she remarked, "Strange that Edwin Clayhanger should call just tonight." Hilda's cheek warmed. "He asked me to go and look over their printing works tomorrow," she said quickly. Janet was taken aback. "Really?" she exclaimed, unmistakably startled. She spoke a second too soon. If she delayed only 1 second, she might have concealed from Hilda that which Hilda had most plainly perceived, to wit, anxiety and jealousy. Yes, jealousy in this adorably benevolent creature's tone. Hilda's interest in tomorrow afternoon was intensified. "Shall you be able to come?" she asked. "What time?" "He said about 6:30 or 6:45. "I can't," said Janet dreamily, because of that musical society meeting. You know, I told you, didn't I?" In the faint light of the dying fire, Hilda made out little by little the mysterious pale heaps of clothes, and all the details of the room strewn and disordered by reason of an additional occupant. The adventure was now of infinite complexity, and its complexity seemed to be symbolized by the suggested feminine mysteriousness of what she saw and what she divined in the darkness of the chamber. She thought, "I am here on false pretences. I ought to tell my secret. That would be fair. I have no right to intrude between her and him." But she instinctively and powerfully resisted such ideas. With firmness she put them away, and yielded herself with a more exquisite apprehension to the anticipation of tomorrow. 2. The order of meals at Lane End was somewhat peculiar even then, and would now be almost unique. It was partly the natural expression of an instinctive and justified feeling of superiority, and partly due to a discretion which forbade the family to scandalize the professional classes of the district by dining at night. Dinner occurred in the middle of the day, and about 9 in the evening was an informal but copious supper. Between these two meals there came a tea which was neither high or low, and whose hour, 6 o'clock in theory, depended to a certain extent, in practice, on Mr. Orgreave's arrival from the office. Not seldom Mr. Orgreave was late. Occasionally he was very late. The kitchen waited to infuse the tea until a command came from some woman, old or young, who attentively watched a window for a particular swinging of the long gate at the end of the garden, or listened, when it was dark, for the bang of the gate and a particular crunching of gravel. On this Tuesday evening Osmond Orgreave was very late, and the movement of the household was less smooth than usual, owing to Mrs. Orgreave's illness and to the absence of Janet at Hillport in connection with the projected Hillport Choral Society. Had Janet been warned of Hilda's visit, she would not have accepted an invitation to a tea at Hillport as a preliminary to the meeting of the Provisional Committee. Hilda was in a state of acute distress. The appointment with Edwin Clayhanger seemed to be absolutely sacred to her. To be late for it would amount to a crime. To miss it altogether would be a calamity inconceivable. The fingers of all the clocks in the house were revolving with the most extraordinary rapidity. She was helpless. She was helpless because she had said nothing all day of her appointment, and because Janet had not mentioned it either. Janet might have said before leaving, "Tea had better not wait too long. Hilda has to be down at Clayhanger's at 6:30. Janet's silence impressed Hilda. It was not merely strange, it was formidable. It affected the whole day. Hilda thought, "Is she determined not to speak of it unless I do?" Immediately Janet was gone, Hilda had run up to the bedroom. She was minded to change the black frock which she had been wearing, and which she hated, and to put on another skirt and bodice that Janet had praised. She longed to beautify herself, and yet she was still hesitating about it at 5:30 in the evening, as she had hesitated at 8 in the morning. In the end she decided not to change, on account of the rain. But the rain had naught to do with her decision. She would not change because she was too proud to change. She would go just as she was. She could not accept the assistance of an attractive bodice. Unfeminine, perhaps, but womanly. At 7:25 she went into Mrs. Orgreave's bedroom rather like a child, and also rather like an adult creature in a distracting crisis. Tom Orgreave and Alicia were filling the entire house with the stormy noise of a piano duet based upon Rossini's William Tell. "I think I'll miss tea, Mrs. Orgreave," she said. "Edwin Clayhanger invited me to go over the printing works at 6:30, and it's 7:25 now." "Oh, but my dear," cried Mrs. Orgreave, "why ever didn't you tell them downstairs, or let me know earlier?" And she pulled at the bell rope that overhung the head of the bed. Not a trace of teasing archness in her manner. Hilda's appointment might have been of the most serious business interest, for anything Mrs. Orgreave's demeanour indicated to the contrary. Hilda stood, mute and constrained. "You run down and tell them to make tea at once, dear. I can't let you go without anything at all. I wonder what can have kept Osmond." Almost at the same moment Osmond Orgreave entered the bedroom. His arrival had been unnoticed amid the tremendous resounding of the duet. "Oh, Osmond," said his wife, "wherever have you been so late? Hilda wants to go. Edwin Clayhanger has invited her to go over the works." Hilda, trembling at the door, more than half expected Mr. Orgreave to say,
You mean she's invited herself? But Osmond received the information with exactly the same polite, apologetic seriousness as his wife, and, reassured, Hilda departed from the room. 10 minutes later, veiled and cloaked, she stepped out alone into the garden. And instantly her torment was assuaged, and she was happy. She waited at the corner of the street for the steam car. But when the car came thundering down, it was crammed to the step. With a melancholy gesture the driver declined her signal. She set off down Trafalgar Road in the mist and the rain, glad that she had been compelled to walk. It seemed to her that she was on a secret and mystic errand. This was not surprising. The remarkable thing was that all the hurrying people she met seemed also each of them to be on a secret and mystic errand. The shining wet pavement was dotted with dark figures, suggestive and enigmatic, who glided over a floor that was pierced by perpendicular reflections. 3. In the Clayhanger shop, agitated and scarcely aware of what she did, she could nevertheless hear her voice greeting Edwin Clayhanger in firm, calm tones, and she soon perceived very clearly that he was even more acutely nervous than herself, which perception helped to restore her confidence, while at the same time it filled her with bliss. The young, fair man, with his awkward and constrained movements, took possession of her umbrella, and then suggested that she should remove her mackintosh. She obeyed, timid and glad. She stripped off her mackintosh as though she were stripping off her modesty, and stood before him revealed. To complete the sacrifice she raised her veil and smiled up at him, as it were asking, "What next?" Then a fat, untidy old man appeared in the doorway of a cubicle within the shop, and Edwin Clayhanger blushed. "Father, this is Miss Lessways. Miss Lessways, my father. She's come to look over the place." "How do you do, miss?" She shook hands with the tyrannic father, who was, however, despite his reputation, apparently just as nervous as the son. There followed a most sinister moment of silence, and at last the shop door opened and the father turned to greet a customer. Hilda thought, "Suppose this fat old man is one day my father-in-law? Is it possible to imagine him as a father-in-law?" And she had a transient gleam of curiosity concerning the character of the two Clayhanger sisters, and recalled with satisfaction that Janet liked the elder one. Edwin Clayhanger, muttering, pointed to an aperture in the counter, and immediately she was going through it with him, and through a door at the back of the shop. They were alone, facing a rain-soaked yard. Edwin Clayhanger sneezed violently. "It keeps on raining," Edwin murmured. "Better to have kept an umbrella. However—" He glanced at her inquiringly and invitingly. They ran side by side across the yard to a roofed flight of steps that led to the printing office. For a couple of seconds the rain wet them, and then they were under cover again. It seemed to Hilda that they had escaped from the shop like fox-terriers, like two friendly dogs from the surveillance of an incalculable and dangerous old man. She felt a comfortable, friendly confidence in Edwin Clayhanger, a tranquil sentiment such as she had never experienced for George Cannon. After more than a year, and what a period of unforeseen happenings, she thought again, "I like him." Not love, she thought, but liking. She liked being with him. She liked the sensation of putting confidence in him. She liked his youth and her own. She was sorry because he had a cold and was not taking care of it. Now they were climbing a sombre, creaking staircase towards a new and remote world that was separated from the common world just quitted by the adventurous passage of the rainy yard. And now they were amid oily odours in a large raftered workshop full of machines, the printing works. An enormous but very deferential man saluted them with majestic solemnity. He was the foreman, and labelled by his white apron as an artisan, but his gigantic bulk, he would have outweighed the pair of them, and his age set him somehow over them, so that they were a couple of striplings in his vasty presence. When Edwin Clayhanger employed, as it were, daringly, the accents of a master to this intimidating fellow, Hilda thrilled with pleasure at the piquancy of the spectacle, and she was admiringly proud of Edwin. The foreman's immense voice explaining machines and tools caused physical vibrations in her. but she understood nothing of what he said, nothing whatever. She was in a dream of oily odours and monstrous iron constructions, dominated by the grand foreman, and Edwin was in the dream. She began talking quite wildly of the 400th anniversary of the inventor of printing, of which she had read in Cranswick history, at Brighton. Brighton had sunk away over the verge of memory. Even Lane End House was lost somewhere in the vague past. All her previous life had faded. She reflected guiltily, "He's bound to think I've been reading about printing because I was interested in him. I don't care. I hope he does think it." She heard a suggestion that, as it was too late that night to see the largest machine in motion, she might call the next afternoon. She at once promised to come. She impatiently desired now to leave the room where they were and to see something else. And then she feared lest this might be all there was to see. Edwin Clayhanger was edging towards the door. They were alone on the stairway again. The foreman had bowed at the top like a chamberlain. She gathered with delicious anticipation that other and still more recondite interiors awaited her visit. 4. They were in an attic which was used for the storage of reams upon reams of paper. By the light of a candle in a tin candlestick they had passed alone together through corridors and up flights of stairs at the back of the shop. She had seen everything that was connected with the enterprise of steam printing, and now they were at the top of the old house and at the end of the excursion. "I used to work here," said Edwin Clayhanger. She inquired about the work. "Well," he drawled, "reading and writing, you know, at that very table." In the aperture of the window, amid piles of paper, stood a rickety old table covered with dust. "But there's no fireplace," she said, glancing round the room and then directly at him. "I know." "But how did you do in winter?" she eagerly appealed. And he replied shortly, and with a slight charming affectation of pride, "I did without." Her throat tightened, and she could feel the tears suddenly swim in her eyes. She was not touched by the vision of his hardships. It was the thought of all his youth that exquisitely saddened her, or all the years which were and would be for ever hidden from her. She knew that she alone of all human beings was gifted with the power to understand and fully sympathize with him. And so she grieved over the long wilderness of time during which he had been uncomprehended. She wanted, by some immense effort of tenderness, to recompense him for all that he had suffered. And she had a divine curiosity concerning the whole of his past life. She had never had this curiosity in relation to George Cannon. She had only wondered about his affairs with other women. Nor had George Cannon ever evoked the tenderness which sprang up in her from some secret and inexhaustible source at the mere sight of Edwin Clayhanger's wistful smile. Still, in that moment, standing close to Edwin in the high solitude of the shadowed attic, the souvenir of George Cannon gripped her painfully. She thought, "He loves me, and he is ruined, and he will never see me again. And I am here bursting with hope renewed, and dizzy with joy." And she pictured Janet, too, wearying herself at a committee meeting, and she thought, "And here am I." Her bliss was tragic. "I think I ought to be going," she said softly. They rethreaded the corridors, and in each lower room as they passed, Edwin Clayhanger extinguished the gas which he had lit there on the way up, and Hilda waited for him. And then they were back in the crude glare of the shop. The fat, untidy old man was not visible. Edwin helped her with the mackintosh, and she liked him for the awkwardness of his efforts in doing so. At the door she urged him not to come out, and referred to his cold. "This isn't the end of winter, it's the beginning," she warned him. Nobody else, she knew, would watch over him. But he insisted on coming out. They arranged a rendezvous for 3 o'clock on the morrow, and then they shook hands. "Now do go in," she entreated, as she hurried away. The rain had ceased. She fled triumphantly up Trafalgar Road, with her secret, guarding it. "He's in love with me." If a scientific truth is a statement of which the contrary is inconceivable, then it was a scientific truth for her that she and Edwin must come together. She simply would not and could not conceive the future without him. And this so soon, so precipitately soon after her misfortune. But it was her very misfortune which pushed her violently forward. Her life had been convulsed and overthrown by the hazard of destiny,
and she could have no peace now until she had repaired and re-established it. At no matter what risk, the thing must be accomplished quickly, quickly. End of Book 6, Chapter 3. Book 6, Chapter 4 of Hilda Lessways by Arnold BENNETT. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Book 6, Chapter 4. The Call from Brighton. 1. On the next afternoon, at 2:15, Hilda and Janet were sitting together in the breakfast-room. The house was still. The men were either theoretically or practically at business. Alicia was at school. Mrs. Orgreave lay upstairs. The servants had cleared away and washed up the dinner things, and had dined themselves. The kitchen had been cleansed and put in order, and every fire replenished. 2 of the servants were in their own chambers, enfranchised for an hour. 1 only remained on duty. All 6 women had the feeling, which comes to most women at a certain moment in each day, that life had, for a time, deteriorated into the purposeless and the futile, and that it waited, as in a trance, until some external masculine event, expected or unforeseen, should renew its virtue and its energy. Hilda was in half a mind to tell Janet the history of the past year. She wakened up in the night, and perceived with dreadful clearness that trouble lay in front of her. The relations between herself and Edwin Clayhanger were developing with the most dizzy rapidity, and in a direction which she desired. But it would be impossible for her, if she fostered the relations, to continue to keep Edwin in ignorance of the fact that, having been known for about a fortnight as Mrs. George Cannon, she was not what he supposed her to be. With imagination on fire, she was anticipating the rendezvous at 3 o'clock. She reached forward to it in ecstasy, but she might not enjoy it, save as a price which her conscience exacted. She had to say to Edwin Clayhanger that she had been the victim of a bigamist. Could she say it to him? She had not been able to say it even to Janet Orgreave. She would say it first to Janet. There, in the breakfast-room, she would say it. If it killed her to say it, she would say it. She must at any cost be able to respect herself, and, as matters stood, she could not respect herself. Janet, on her knees, was idly arranging books on one of the lower bookshelves. In sheer nervousness, Hilda also dropped to her knees on the hearthrug, and began to worry the fire with the poker. "I say, Janet," she began. "Yes?" Janet did not look up. Hilda, her heart beating, thought with affrighted swiftness, "Why should I tell her? It's no business of anybody's except his. I will tell him, and him alone, and then act according to his wishes. After all, I am not to blame. I am quite innocent. But I won't tell him to-day, not to-day. I must be more sure. It would be ridiculous to tell him to-day. If I told him, it would be almost like inviting a proposal. But when the proper time comes, then I will tell him, and he will understand. He's bound to understand perfectly. He's in love with me." She dared not tell Janet. In that abode of joyful and successful propriety, the words would not form themselves, and the argument that she was not to blame carried no weight whatever. She, Hilda, lacked courage to be candid. This was extremely disconcerting to her self-esteem, and even with Edwin Clayhanger she wished to temporize. She longed for nothing so much as to see him, and yet she feared to meet him. "Yes?" Janet repeated. A bell rang faintly in the distance of the house. Hilda, suddenly choosing a course, said, "I forgot to tell you, I'm supposed to be going down to Clayhanger's at 3 to see a machine at work. It was too late last night. Do come with me. I hate going by myself." It was true. In that instant she did hate going by herself. She thought, knowing Janet to be at liberty, and never dreaming that she would refuse, "I am saved for the present." But Janet answered self-consciously, "I don't think I must leave mother. You'll be perfectly all right by yourself." Hilda impetuously turned her head. Their glances met for an instant, in suspicion, challenge, animosity. They had an immense mutual admiration the one for the other, these two, and yet now they were estranged. Esteem was nullified by instinct. Hilda thought with positive savagery, It's all fiddlesticks about not leaving her mother. She's simply on her high horse." The whole colour of existence was changed. 2. Martha entered the room. Neither of the girls moved. Beneath the deferential servant in Martha was a human girl, making a third in the room, who familiarly divined the moods of the other two and judged them as an equal. And the other two knew it, and therefore did not trouble to be spectacular in front of her. "Hullo, miss," said Martha, approaching Hilda. "The old postman says it was insufficiently addressed, or it would have been here by first post." "Was that the postman who rang just now?" asked Janet. "Yes, miss." Hilda took the letter with apprehension, as she recognized the down-slanting calligraphy of Sarah Gailey. Yes, the address was imperfect. Miss Lessways, care of Osmond Orgreave, Esquire, Lane End House, Knype-on-Trent, instead of Bursley, Knype-on-Trent. On the back of the envelope had been written in pencil by an official, "Try Bursley." Sarah Gailey could not now be trusted to address an envelope correctly. The mere handwriting seemed to announce misfortune. "From poor Sarah," Hilda murmured with false, good-tempered tranquillity. "I wonder what sort of trouble she thinks she's got into." She thought, "If only I was married, I should be free of responsibility about Sarah. I should have to think of my husband first. But nothing else can free me. Unless I marry, I'm tied to Sarah Gailey as long as she lives. And why? I should like to know." The answer was simple. Habit had shackled her to Sarah Gailey. She opened the letter by the flickering firelight, which was stronger on the hearthrug than the light of the dim November day. It began, "Dearest Hilda, I write at once to tell you that a lawyer called here this afternoon to inquire about your Hotel Continental shares. He told me there was going to be some difficulty with the company, and, unless the independent shareholders formed a strong local committee to look after things, the trouble might be serious. He wanted to know if you would support a committee at the meeting. I gave him your address, and he's going to write to you. But I thought I would write to you as well. His name is Eustace Broughton, 124 East Street, in case. I do hope nothing will go wrong. It is like what must be, I am sure. It has been impossible for me to keep the charwoman, so I sent her off this morning. Can you remember the address of that Mrs. Catkin?" Sarah Gailey continued to discuss boarding-house affairs until she arrived at the end of the 4th page, and then in a few cramped words she finished with expressions of love. "Oh dear!" Hilda exclaimed, rising. "I must write some letters at once." She sighed, as if in tedium. The fact that her fortune was vaguely threatened did not cause her anxiety. She scarcely realized it. What she saw was an opportunity to evade the immediate meeting with Edwin, the meeting which, a few minutes earlier, she had desired beyond everything. "When? Now?" Hilda nodded. "But what about Master Edwin?" Janet asked, trying to be gay. "I shan't be able to go," said Hilda carelessly at the door. "It's of no consequence." "Martha has to go down-town. If you liked, she could call in there and just tell him." It was a reproof from the young woman who always so thoughtfully studied the feelings of everybody. "I'll just write a little note then, thanks," Hilda returned calmly, triumphing after all over Janet's superiority, and thinking, "Janet can be very peculiar, Janet can." 3. For more than 20 hours Hilda was profoundly miserable. Towards the evening of the same day she had made herself quite sure that Edwin Clayhanger would call that night. Her hope persisted until 9:30. It then began to fade, and at 10 o'clock was extinct. His name had been mentioned by nobody. She went to bed. Having now a room of her own, which overlooked the Clayhanger garden and house, she gazed forth, and in the dark beheld, with the most anxious sensations, the building in which Edwin existed and was concealed. "He is there," she said. "He is active about something at this very instant. Perhaps he is reading. He is close by. If I shouted, he might hear." And yet she was utterly cut off from him. Again, in the late dawn, she saw the same building, pale and clear, but just as secretive and enigmatic as in the night. "He is asleep yet," she thought. "Why did he not call? Is he hurt? Is he proud?" She despaired because she could devise no means of resuming communication with him. Immediately after dinner on the next day She went with Janet to Janet's room to examine a new winter cloak which had been delivered. And while Janet was trying it on and posing coquettishly and yet without affectation in front of the glass, and while Hilda was reflecting jealously, "Why am I not like her? I know infinitely more than she knows. I am a woman, and she is a girl, and yet she seems far more than a woman than I." Alicia, contrary to all rules, took the room by storm. Alicia's excuse and salvation lay in a telegram which she held in her hand. "For you, Hilda!" cried the child, excited. "I'm just off to school." Hilda reached to take the offered telegram, but her hand wavered around it instead of seizing it. Her eye fastened on a circular portion of the wallpaper pattern, and she felt that the whole room was revolving about her. Then she saw Janet's face transformed by an expression of alarm. "Are you ill, Hilda?" Janet demanded. "Sit down." "You're frightfully pale," said Alicia eagerly. Hilda sat down. "No, no," she said, "it was the pattern of the wallpaper that made me feel dizzy." And for the moment she did honestly believe that the pattern of the wallpaper had, in some inexplicable manner, upset her. "I'm all right now." The dizziness passed as suddenly as it had supervened. Janet held some ineffectual salts to her nose. "I'm perfectly well," insisted Hilda. "How funny!" Alicia grinned. Calmly Hilda opened the telegram, which read, "Please come at once. Gaily." She gave the telegram to Janet in silence. "What can be the matter?" Janet asked, with unreserved, loving solicitude. The cloud which had hung between the two enthusiastic friends was dissipated in a flash. "I haven't an idea," said Hilda, touched, "unless it's those shares." She briefly told Janet about the Hotel Continental Limited. "Shall you go?" Hilda nodded. Never again would she ignore an urgent telegram, though she did not believe that this telegram had any real importance. She attributed it to Sarah's increasing incompetence and hysterical foolishness. "I wonder whether I can get on to Brighton tonight if I take the 6th train?" Hilda asked, and to herself, "Can it have anything to do with George?" Alicia, endowed with authority, went in search of a Bradshaw, but the quest was fruitless. In the 5 Towns the local timetable showing the connections with London suffices for the citizen, and the breast pocket of no citizen is complete without it. "Clayhangers are bound to have a Bradshaw," cried Alicia, breathless with running about the house. "Of course they are," Janet agreed. "I'll walk down there now," said Hilda with extraordinary promptitude. "It won't take 5 minutes." "I'd go," said Alicia, "only I should be late for school." "Shall I send some one down?" Janet suggested. "You might be taken dizzy again." "No, thanks," Hilda replied deliberately. "I'll go myself. There's nothing wrong with me at all." "You'll have to be sharp over it," said Alicia pertly. "Don't forget it's Thursday. They shut up at 2, and it's not far off 2 now." "I'm going this very minute," said Hilda. "And I'm going this very second," Alicia retorted. They all three left Janet's bedroom. The new cloak cast over a chair back was degraded into a tedious banality, and ignored. In less than a minute Hilda, hatted and jacketed and partially gloved, was crossing the garden. She felt most miraculously happy and hopeful, and she was full of irrational gratitude to Alicia, as though Alicia were a benefactor. The change in her mood seemed magic in its swiftness. If Janet, with calm, cryptic face, had not been watching her from the doorway, she might have danced on the gravel. End of Book 6, Chapter 4. Book 6, Chapter 5 of Hilda Lessways by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Book 6, Chapter 5, Thursday Afternoon. 1. She was walking with Edwin Clayhanger up Duck Bank on the way to Bursley railway station. A simple errand and promenade, and yet she felt herself to be steeped in the romance of an adventure. The adventure had surprisingly followed upon the discovery that Alicia had been quite wrong. "Clayhangers are bound to have a Bradshaw," the confident Alicia had said. But Clayhangers happened not to have a Bradshaw. Edwin was alone in the stationery shop, save for the assistant. He said that his father was indisposed, and whereas the news that Clayhangers had no Bradshaw left Hilda perfectly indifferent, The news that old Darius Clayhanger was indisposed and absent produced in her a definite feeling of gladness. Edwin had decided that the most likely place to search for a Bradshaw was the station, and he had offered to escort her to the station. Nothing could have been more natural, and at the same time more miraculous. The sun was palely shining upon dry, clean pavements, and upon roads juicy with black mud, and in the sunshine Hilda was very happy. It was nothing to her that she was in quest of a Bradshaw because she had just received an ominous telegram urgently summoning her to Brighton. She was obliviously happy. Every phenomenon that attracted her notice contributed to her felicity. Thus she took an eager joy in the sun, and a marked improvement in Edwin's cold really delighted her. She was dominated by the intimate conviction, "He loves me," which conviction excited her dormant pride and made her straighten her shoulders. She benevolently condescended towards Janet. After all, Janet, with every circumstance in her favour, had not known how to conquer Edwin Clayhanger. After all, she, Hilda, possessed some mysterious characteristic more potent than the elegance and the goodness of Janet Orgreave. She scorned her former self-deprecations, and reproached her own lack of faith. I am I. That was the summary of her mood. As for her attitude to Edwin Clayhanger, she could not explain it. Why did she like him, and like being with him? He was not brilliant, nor masterful, nor handsome, nor well-dressed, nor in any manner imposing. On the contrary, he was awkward and apologetic, and not a bit spectacular. Only the wistful gaze of his eyes, and his honest smile, and the appeal of his gestures. A puzzling affair, an affair perfectly incomprehensible, and enchanting. They walked side by side in silence. When they had turned into Moorthorne Road, halfway up whose slope lies the station, she asked a question about a large wooden building from whose interior came wild sounds of shouting and cheering, and learnt that the Potters on strike were holding a meeting in the town theatre. At the open outer doors was a crowd of starving, shivering, dirty, ragged children, who romped and cursed or stood unnaturally meditative in the rich mud, like fakirs fulfilling a vow. Hilda's throat was constricted by the sight. Pain and joy ran together in her, burning exquisitely, and she had a glimpse, obscure, of the mystical beauty of the children's suffering. "I'd no idea there was a theatre in Bursley," she remarked idly, driven into a banality by the press of her sensations. "They used to call it the Blood Tub," he replied. "Melodrama and murder and gore, you know." She exclaimed in horror. "Why are people like that in the Five Towns?" "It's our form of poetry, I suppose," said he. She started sensitively. It seemed to her that she had never understood the secret inner spirit of the Five Towns, and that by a single phrase he had made her understand it. Our form of poetry! Who but he could have said a thing at once so illuminating and so simple? Apparently perplexed by the obvious effect on her of his remark, he said, "But you belong to the Five Towns, don't you?" She answered quietly that she did, but her heart was saying, "I do now. You have initiated me. I never felt the Five Towns before. You have made me feel them." 2. At the station the head porter received their inquiry for a Bradshaw with a dull stare and a shake of the head. No such thing had ever been asked for at Bursley station before, and the man's imagination could not go beyond the soiled timetables loosely pinned and pasted up on the walls of the booking office. Hilda suggested that the ticket clerk should be interrogated, but the aperture of communication with him was shut. She saw Edwin Clayhanger brace himself and rap on the wood, and instead of deploring his diffidence, she liked it and found it full of charm. The partition clicked aside, and the ticket clerk's peering, suspicious head showed in its place, mutely demanding a reason for this extraordinary disturbance of the dream in which the station slumbered between two half-hourly trains. With a characteristic peculiar slanting motion, Edwin nodded. "Oh, how do you do, Mr. Brooks?" said Edwin hastily, as if startled by the sudden inexplicable apparition of the head. But the ticket clerk had no Bradshaw either. He considered it probable, however, that the station-master would have a Bradshaw. Edwin had to brace himself again for an assault upon the fastness of the station-master. And in the incredibly small and incredibly dirty fastness of the station-master they indeed found a Bradshaw. Hilda precipitately took it and opened it on the station-master's table. She looked for Brighton in it as she might have looked for a particular individual in a city. Then Edwin was bending over it with his ear close to her ear, and the sleeve of his overcoat touching her sleeve. She was physically aware of him for the first time. She thought, disconcerted, "But he's an utter stranger to me. What do I know of him?" And then she thought, "For more than a year he must have carried my image in his heart." "Here," said Edwin brusquely and with a certain superiority, "you might just let me have a look at it myself." She yielded, tacitly admitting that a woman was no match for Bradshaw. After a few moments' frowning, Edwin said, "Yes, there's a train to Brighton at 11:30 tonight." "May I look?" "Certainly," said he, subtly condescending. She examined the page with a serious deliberation. "But what does this F mean?" she asked. "Did you notice this F?" "Yes, it means Thursdays and Saturdays only," said Edwin, his eyes twinkling. It was as if he had said, "You think yourself very clever, but do you suppose that I can't read the notes in a timetable?" "Well," she hesitated. "Today's Thursday, you see," he remarked curtly. She was ravished by his tone and his manner, and she became humble before him, for in the space of a few seconds he had grown mysteriously and powerfully masculine to her. But with all his masculinity there remained the same wistful, honest, boyish look in his eyes. And she thought, "If I marry him, it will be for the look in his eyes." "I'm all right, then," she said aloud, and smiled. With hands nervously working within her muff, she suddenly missed the handkerchief which she had placed there. "I believe I must have dropped my handkerchief in your shop," she was about to say. The phrase was actually on her tongue, but by a strange, instinctive, defensive discretion she shut her mouth on it and kept silence. She thought, "Perhaps I had better not go into his shop again to-day." 3. They descended the hill from the station. Hilda was very ill at ease. She kept saying to herself, "This adventure is over now. I cannot prolong it. There is nothing to do but to go back to the Orgreaves and pack my things and depart to Brighton and face whatever annoyances awaiting me at Brighton." The prospect desolated her. She could not bear to leave Edwin Clayhanger without some definition of their relations, and yet she knew that it was hopeless and absurd to expect to arrive immediately at any such definition. She knew that the impetuosity of her temperament could not be justified. Also, she feared horribly the risk of being caught again in the net of Brighton. As they got lower and lower down the hill, her wretchedness and disquiet became acute, to the point of a wild despair. Merely to temporize, she said, as they drew opposite the wooden theatre, "Couldn't we just go and look in? I've got plenty of time." A strange request, to penetrate into a meeting of artisans on strike. She felt its strangeness. She felt that Edwin Clayhanger objected, but she was driven to an extremity. She had to do something, and she did what she could. They crossed the road and entered the huge shanty, and stood apologetically near the door. The contrast between the open street and the enclosed stuffiness of the dim and crowded interior was overwhelming. Hundreds of ragged and shabby men sat in serried rows, leaning forward with elbows out and heads protruding, as they listened to a speech from the gimcrack stage. They seemed to be waiting to spring, like famished and ferocious tigers. Interrupting, they growled, snarled, yapped, and swore with appalling sincerity. Imprecations burst forth in volleys and in running fires. The arousing of the fundamental instincts of these human beings had, indeed, enormously emphasized the animal in them. They had swung back 100 centuries towards original, crude life. The sophistication which embroiders the will to live had been stripped clean off. These men helped you to understand the state of mind which puts a city to the sack, and makes victims especially of the innocent and the defenceless. Hilda was strangely excited. She was afraid and enjoyed being afraid, and it was as if she too had been returned to savagery and to the primeval. In the midst of peril she was a female under the protection of a male, and nothing but that. and she was far closer emotionally to her mail than she'd ever been before. Suddenly the meeting came to an end. In an instant the mass of humanity was afoot and rounding upon them an active menace. Hilda and Edwin rushed fleeing into the street, violently urged by a common impulse. The stream of embittered men pursued them like an inundation. When they were safe and breathing the free air, Hilda was drenched with a sense of pity. The tragedy of existence presented itself in its true aspect, as noble and majestic and intimidating. "It's terrible," she breathed. She thought, "No, in this mood it is impossible for me to leave him. I cannot do it. I cannot." The danger of re-entering the shop, which would be closed now, utterly fascinated her. Supposing that she re-entered the shop with him, would she have the courage to tell him that she was in his society under false pretences? Could she bring herself to relate her misfortune? She recoiled before the mere idea of telling him, and yet the danger of the shop glittered in front of her like a lure. The future might be depending solely on her own act. If she told him of the lost handkerchief, the future might be one thing. If she did not tell him, it might be another. The dread of choosing seized her, and put her into a tremble of apprehension. And then, as it were mechanically, she murmured, but very clearly, tacking the words without a pause onto a sentence about the strikes, "Oh, I've lost my handkerchief, and so I've left it in your shop. It must have dropped out of my muff." She sighed in relief because she had chosen, but her agitation was intensified. 4. In search of a lost handkerchief they regained the Clayhanger premises by an unfamiliar side door. She preceded him along a passage, and then, taking a door on the left, found herself surprisingly in the shop behind a counter. The shop was lighted only by a few diamond-shaped holes in the central shutters, and it had a troubling aspect of portent, with its merchandise mysteriously enveloped in pale sheets, and its chairs wrong side up, and its deep-shadowed corners. Destiny might have been lurking in one of those baffling corners. From above, through the ceiling, came the vibration of some machine at work, and the machine might have been the loom of time. Hilda was exquisitely apprehensive. She thought, "I am here. The moment of my departure will come. When it comes, shall I have told him my misfortune? What will have happened?" She waited, nervous, restless, shaking like a victim who can do naught but wait. "Here's my handkerchief," she cried in a tone of unnatural childish glee. That was one of the effects of her secret panic. The handkerchief glimmered on the counter, more white than anything else in that grey dusk. She guessed that the shop assistant must have found it and placed it conspicuously on the counter. They were alone. They were their own prisoners, secure from the street and from all interruption. Hilda, once more and in a higher degree, realized the miraculous human power to make experience out of nothing. They had nothing but themselves, and they could, if they chose, create all their future by a single gesture. Suddenly there came a tremendous shouting from Duck Square, in front of the shop. The strikers had poured down from Moorthorne Road into Duck Bank and Duck Square. Edwin, who was in the middle of the shop, went to the glazed inner doors, and, passing through into the porch, lifted the letter flap in a shutter, and, stooping, looked forth. He called to her, without moving his face from the aperture, that a fight was in progress. Hilda gazed at his back, through the glass, and then, coming round the end of the counter, approached quietly and stood immediately behind him, between the glazed doors and the shutters. The two were in a space so small that they could scarcely have moved without touching. Let me look," she stammered, unable any longer to tolerate the inaction. Edwin Clayhanger stepped aside and held up the letter flap for her with his finger. She bent her head to the oblong glimpse of the street, and saw the strikers engaged in the final internecine folly of strikers. They had turned their exasperated wrath upon each other. Within a public house at the top of the little square, other strikers were drinking. One policeman regarded them. "What a shame!" she cried angrily, dropping the flap, and then withdrew quickly into the shop whither Edwin had gone. And as she came near him, her mood changed. She smiled gently.
She summoned all her charm, and she knew that she charmed him. "Do you know," she said, "you've quite altered my notion of poetry, what you said as we were going up to the station." "Really?" He flushed. Yes, she had enchanted and entranced him. She had only to smile and to use a particular tone, soft and breaking. She knew that. "But you do alter my notions," she continued, and her clear voice was poured out like a liquid. "I don't know how it is." She stopped, and then, in half playful accents, "So this is your little office?" Her hand was on the knob of the open door of the cubicle, a black erection within the shop, where Edwin and his father kept the accounts and wrote letters. "Yes, go in and have a look at it." She murmured kindly, "Shall I?" and went in. He followed. For a moment she was extremely afraid, and she whispered, scared, "I must hurry off now." He ignored this remark. "Shall you be at Brighton long?" he demanded. And he was so friendly and simple and timorous and honest-eyed, and his features had such an extraordinary anxious expression, that her own fear seemed to leave her. She thought, as if surprised by the discovery, "He is a good friend." "Oh, I can't tell," she answered him. "It depends." "How soon should he be down our way again?" His voice was thickening. She shook her head, speechless. She was afraid again now. His face altered. He was standing almost over her. She thought, "I am lost. I have let it come to this." He was no longer a good friend. He began to speak in detached bits of phrases. "I say, you know—" "Good-bye, good-bye," she murmured anxiously. "I must go. Thanks very much." And foolishly she held out her hand, which he seized. He bent passionately, and kissed her like a fresh boy, like a schoolboy. And she gave back the kiss strongly, with all the profound sincerity of her nature. His agitation appeared to be extreme, but she was calm. She was divinely calm. She savoured the moment as though she had been a watcher and not an actor in the scene. She thought, with a secret sigh of bliss, "Yes, it is real, this moment, and I have had it. Am I astonished that it has come so soon, or did I know it was coming?" Her eyes drank up the face and the hands and the gestures of her lover. She felt tired and sat down in the office chair, and he leaned on the desk, and the walls of the cubicle folded them in, even from the inanimate scrutiny of the shop. 5. They were talking together, half fearfully, and yet with the confidence of deep mutual trust, in the quick gathering darkness of the cubicle. And while they were talking, Hilda, in her head, was writing a fervent letter to him. "You see, it was so sudden. I'd had no chance to tell you. I did so want to tell you, but how could I? And I hadn't told anybody. I'm sure you'll agree with me that it is best to tell some things as little as possible. And when you had kissed me, how could I tell you then, at once? I could not. It would have spoilt everything. Surely you understand?" "I know you do, because you understand everything." "If I was wrong, tell me where. You don't guess how humble I am. When I think of you, I am the humblest girl you can imagine. Forgive me, if there is anything to forgive. I don't need to tell you that I have suffered." And she kept writing the letter again and again, slightly altering the phrases so as to improve them, so as to express herself better and more honestly and more appealingly. "I shall send you the address to-morrow," she was saying to him. "I shall write to you before I go to bed, whether it's to-night or to-morrow morning." She put the fire of her love into the assurance. She smiled to entrance him, and saw on his face that he was beside himself with joy in her. She was a queen, surpassing in her prerogative 1,000 elegant Janets. She smiled, she proudly straightened her shoulders, she the humblest, and her boy was enslaved. "I wonder what people will say," he murmured. She said, with a pang of misgiving about his reception of her letter, "Please tell no one." She pleaded that for the present he should tell no one. Later on it won't seem so sudden," she added plausibly. "People are so silly." The sound of another battle in Duck Square awoke them. The shop was very chilly and quite dark. Their faces were only pale ovals in the blackness. She shivered. "I must go. I have to pack." He clasped her, and she was innocently content. She was a young girl again. "I'll walk up with you," he said protectively. But she would not allow him to walk up with her, and he yielded. He struck a match. They stumbled out, and in the midnight of the passage he took leave of her. Walking up Trafalgar Road alone, she was so happy, so amazed, so relieved, so sure of him and of his fineness and of the future, that she could scarcely bear her felicity. It was too intense. At last her life was settled and mapped out. Destiny had been kind, and she meant to be worthy of her fate. She could have swooned, so intoxicant was her wonder and her solemn joy, and her yearning after righteousness in love. End of Book 6, Chapter 5. Book 6, Chapter 6 of Hilda Lessways by Arnold BENNETT. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Book 6, Chapter 6. Mischance. 1. 12 days later, in the evening, Hilda stood by the bedside of Sarah Gailey in the basement room of No. 59 Preston Street. There was a bright fire in the grate, and in front of the fire a middle-aged doctor was cleansing the instrument which he had just employed to inject morphia into Sarah's exhausted body. Hilda's assumption that the ageing woman had telegraphed for her on inadequate grounds had proved to be quite wrong. Upon entering the house on that Thursday night, Hilda, despite the anxious, pale face of the new servant who had waited up for her, and who entreated her to see Sarah Gailey instantly, had gone first to her own room and scrawled passionately a note to Edwin, which ran: "Dearest, this is my address. I love you. Every bit of me is absolutely yours. Write me. H.L." She gave the letter to the servant to post at once, and as she gave it she had a vision of it travelling in post-office railway vans, and being sorted and sealed up in a bag, and recovered from the bag, and scanned by the postman at Bursley, and borne up Trafalgar Road by the postman, and dropped into the letter-box at Edwin's house, and finally seized by Edwin, and of it pleasing him intensely, for it was a good letter, and she was proud of it because she knew that it was characteristic. And then, with her mind freed, she had opened the door of Sarah's bedroom. Sarah was unquestionably very ill. Sarah had been quite right in telegraphing so peremptorily to Hilda, and if she had not so telegraphed, she would have been quite wrong. On the previous day she had been sitting on the cold new oilcloth of the topmost stairs, minutely instructing a maid in the craft of polishing banisters. And the next morning an attack of acute sciatica had supervened. For a trifling indiscretion, Sarah was thus condemned to extreme physical torture. Hilda had found her rigid on the bed. She suffered the severest pain in the small of the back, and all down the left leg. Her left knee was supported on pillows, and the bedclothes were raised away from it, for it could tolerate no weight whatever. The doctor, who had been and gone, had arranged a system of fomentation and hot water bottles surpassing anything in even Sarah's experience. And there Sarah lay, not feverish, but sweating with agony, terrified to move, terrified to take a deep breath, lest the disturbance of the muscles might produce consequences beyond her strength to endure. She was in no danger of death. She could talk, she could eat and drink, her pulse was scarcely quickened. But she was degraded and humiliated by mere physical anguish to the condition of a brute. This was her lot in life. All through that first night Hilda stayed with her, trying to pretend that Sarah was a woman, and in the morning she had assumed control of the house. She had her secret to console her. It remained a secret because there was no one to whom she could relate it. Sarah had no ear for news unconnected with her malady, and indeed to tell Sarah, as Sarah was, would have been to carry callousness to the point of insult. And so Hilda, amid her enormous labours and fatigue, had lived with her secret, which, from being a perfumed delight, turned in 2 days to something subtly horrible, to something that by its horror prevented her from writing to Edwin aught but the briefest missives. She had existed from hour to hour, from 1 minute apprehensively to the next, day and night, hardly sleeping, devoured inwardly by a fear at once monstrous and simple, at once convincing and incredible. As for the letter which mentally she had composed 100 times to Edwin, and which she owed to him, it had become fantastic, and then inconceivable to her. 2. One of the new servants entered the room and handed a letter to Hilda, and left the room and shut the door. The envelope was addressed Miss Lessways, 59 Preston Street, Brighton, in Edwin Clayhanger's beautiful handwriting. Every evening came thus a letter, which he had posted in Bursley on the previous day. Hilda thought, "Will this contain another reproach of my irregularity? I can't bear it if it does." And she gazed at the handwriting, and in particular at her own name, and her own name seemed to be the name of somebody else, of some strange young woman. She felt dizzy. The door of Sarah's wardrobe was ajar, and in the mirror of it Hilda could see herself obscurely, a black-robed, strange young woman, with untidy hair and white cheeks, and huge, dark, staring, heavy eyes, with pouches beneath them. The image wavered in the mirror. She thought, "Here it is again, this awful feeling. Surely I'm not going to faint." She could hear Sarah's sighing breath. She could hear the singing of the shaded gas flame. She turned her gaze away from the mirror, and saw Sarah's grey head inadvertently nodding, as it always nodded. Then the letter slipped out of her hand. She glanced down at the floor in pursuit of it. The floor was darkly revolving. She thought, "Am I really fainting this time? I mustn't faint. I've got to arrange about that bacon tonight, and lots of things. Sarah is not a bit better, and I must sit with her until she gets off to sleep." Her legs trembled, and she was terrorized by extraordinarily novel sensations of insecurity. "Oh!" she murmured weakly. 3. "You've only fainted," said the doctor in a low voice. She perceived little by little that she was lying flat on the floor at the foot of Sarah's bed, and that he was kneeling beside her. The bed threw a shadow on them both, but she could see his benevolent face, anxious and yet reassuring, rather clearly. "What?" she whispered in feeble despair. She felt that her resistance was definitely broken. From higher up at the level of the hidden bed came the regular plaintive respiration of Sarah Gailey. "You must take care of yourself better than this," said the doctor. "Perhaps this is a day when you ought to be resting." She answered, resigned, "No, it's not that. I believe I'm going to have a child. You must—" She stopped. "Oh," said the doctor with discretion. "Is that it?" Strange how the direct words would create a new situation. She had not told the doctor that she had been through the ceremony of marriage and had been victimized. She had told him nothing but the central and final thought in her mind. And lo, the new situation was brought into being, and the doctor was accepting it. He was not omitting astounded buts. Her directness had made all possible buts seem ridiculous and futile, and had made the expression of curiosity seem offensive. She lay on the floor impassive. She was no longer horrified by expectancy. "Well," said the doctor, "we must see. I think you can sit up now, can't you?" 3/4 of an hour afterwards she went into Sarah's room alone. She was aware of no emotion whatever. She merely desired, as a professional nurse might have desired, to see if Sarah slept. Sarah was not sleeping. She moaned, as she moaned continually when awake. Hilda bent over her trembling head, whose right side pressed upon the pillow. "How queer," thought Hilda, "how awful that she didn't even hear what I said to him. It will almost kill her when she does know." Sarah's eyes blinked. Without stirring, without shifting her horizontal, preoccupied gaze from the wall, she muttered peevishly, "What's that you were saying about going to have a child?" Startled, Hilda moved back a little from the bed. "The doctor says there's no doubt I am," Hilda answered coldly. "How queer," Sarah said. "I quite thought... But of course a girl like you couldn't be sure. I should like another biscuit. But I don't want the Osbornes, the others." She resumed her moaning. On the following Saturday morning, rather more than a fortnight after her engagement to Edwin Clayhanger, Hilda came out of the kitchen at No. 59 Preston Street and shut the door on a nauseating, malodorous mess of broken food and greasy plates, in the midst of which two servants were noisily gobbling down their late breakfast and disputing. With a frown of disgust on her face, she looked into Sarah Gailey's bedroom. Sarah, though vaguely better, was still in constant acute pain, and her knee still reposed on a pillow and was protected from the upper bedclothes, and she still could not move. Hilda put on a smile for Sarah Gailey, who nodded morosely, and then, extinguishing the smile as if it had been expensive gas burning to no purpose, she passed into the basement sitting-room and slaked the fire there. With a gesture of irresolution, she lifted the lid of the desk in the corner, and gazed first at a little pile of 4 unopened letters addressed to her in Edwin's handwriting, and then at a volume of Crashaw, which the enthusiastic Tom Orgreave had sent to her as a reward for her appreciation of Crashaw's poems. She released the lid suddenly, and went upstairs to her bedroom, chatting sugarily for an instant on the way with the second Miss Watchett. In the bedroom she donned her street things, and then she descended. She had to go to the registry office in North Street about a new cook. She stopped at the front door, and then surprisingly went down once more into the basement sitting-room. Standing up at the desk, she wrote this letter. "Darling Janet, I am now married to George Cannon. The marriage is not quite public, but I tell you before anybody, and you might tell Edwin Clayhanger. Your loving H. L." Least said, soonest mended, and the conciseness would discourage questioning. She inserted the letter into an envelope, which she addressed and stamped, and then she fled with it from the house, and in 2 minutes it was in a letter-box, and she was walking slowly along the King's Road past the shops. The letter was the swift and desperate sequel to several days' absolutely sterile reflection. It said enough for the moment. Later she could explain that her husband had left her. She could not write to Edwin. She could not bring herself to write anything to him. She could not confess, nor beg for forgiveness, nor even for sympathetic understanding. She could not admit the uninstructed rashness which had led her to assume positively, on inadequate grounds, that her union with George Cannon had been fruitless. She must suffer, and he also must suffer. Rather than let him know in any conceivable manner that all unwitting she was bearing the child of another at the moment of her betrothal to himself, she preferred to be regarded as a jilt of the very worst kind. Strange that she should choose the role of deceiver instead of the role of victim. Strange that she would sooner be hated and scorned than pitied. Strange that she would not even give Edwin the opportunity of treating her as a widow. But so it was. For her, the one possible attitude towards Edwin was the attitude of silence. In the silence of the grave, her love for him existed. As she walked along the chill promenade, she looked with discreet curiosity at every woman she met, to see her condition. This matter, which before she had never thought of, now obsessed her, and all women were divided for her into 2 classes, the expectant and the others. Also, her self-consciousness was extreme, more so even than it had been after her mother's death. She was not frightened, yet. She was assuredly not panic-struck. Rather, her mood was grim, harsh, and calmly bitter. She thought, "I suppose George must be informed." It affected her queerly that if she took it into her head she need never go back to Preston Street. She was free. She owed nothing to anybody. And yet she would go back. She would require a home soon, and she would require a livelihood, for the shares of the Brighton Hotel Continental Limited promised to be sterile and were already unsaleable. But apart from these considerations, she would have gone back for Sarah Gailey, because Sarah Gailey was entirely dependent on her. She detested Sarah, despite Sarah's sufferings, and yet, by her conscience, she was for ever bound to her. The future loomed appalling. Sarah's career was finished. She could not be anything but a burden and a torment. Her last years would probably be dreadful both for herself and for others. The prospects of the boarding-house were not radiant. Hilda could direct the enterprise, but not well. She could work, but she had not the art of making others work. Already the place was slightly at sixes and sevens, and she loathed it. She loathed the whole business of catering. Along the entire length of the King's Road the smells of basement kitchens ascended to the pavement and offended the nose. And Hilda saw all Brighton as a colossal and disgusting enlargement of the kitchen at number 59. She saw the background and the pits of Brighton, that which underlies and hides behind and is not seen. The grandeur of the King's Road was naught to her. Her glance pierced it, and it faded to a hallucination. Beyond it she envisaged the years to come, the messy and endless struggle, the necessary avarice and trickeries incidental to it, and perhaps the ultimate failure. She would never make money. She felt that. She was not born to make money, especially by dodges and false politeness, out of idle, empty-noddled boarders. She would lose it and lose it. And she pictured what she would be in 10 years, the hard-driven landlady, up to every subterfuge, with a child to feed and educate, and perhaps a bedridden, querulous invalid to support. And there was no alternative to the tableau. She went by the Chichester, which towered with all its stories above her head. Who would take it now? George Cannon would have made it pay. He would have made anything pay. How? She was definitely cut off from the magnificence of the King's Road. The side street was her destiny, the side street and shabbiness, and it was all George's fault, and hers. The poverty, if it came, would be George's fault alone, for he had squandered her money in a speculation. It astounded her that George, so shrewd and well-balanced, should have made an investment so foolish. She did not realize that a passion for a business enterprise, as for a woman, is capable of destroying the balance of any man. And George Cannon had had both passions. And then she saw Florrie Bagster on the other side of the street, walking leisurely by the sea wall, alone. If Mr. Boutwood had had a more generous and wild disposition, he might have allowed Florrie to ruin him in 6 months of furs and carriages and champagne. But Mr. Boutwood, though a dog, was a careful dog, especially at those moments when the conventional dog can refuse nothing. Florrie was well and warmly dressed, no more, and she was on foot. Hilda's gaze fastened on her, and immediately divined from the cut and fall of the coat that Florrie had something to conceal from everyone but her Mr. Boutwood. And whereas Florrie trod the pavement with a charming little air that wavered between impudence and modesty, between timid meekness and conceit, Hilda blushed with shame and pity. She on one footpath, and Florrie on the other. Soon, she thought, I shall not be able to walk along this road. She had sinned. She admitted that she had sinned against some quality in herself. But how innocently and how ignorantly, and what a tremendous punishment for so transient a weakness! And new consequences, still more disastrous than any she had foreseen, presented themselves one after another. George had escaped, but a word of open scandal, a single whisper in the ear of the old creature down at Torquay, might actuate machinery that would reach out after him and drag him back, and plant him in jail. George, the father of her child, in jail? It was all a matter of chance, sheer chance. She began to perceive what life really was, and the immense importance of hazard therein. Nevertheless, without frailty, without defection, what could chance have done? She began to perceive that this that she was living through was life. She bit her lips. Grief, shame, disillusion, hardship, peril, catastrophe, exile. Above all, exile. These had to be faced, and they would be faced. She recalled the fiery verse of Crashaw, and she set her shoulders back. There was the stuff of a woman in her. Only a little while, and she had seen before her a beloved boy entranced by her charm. She had now no charm. Where now was the soft virgin? And yet, somehow, magically, miraculously, The soft virgin was still there, and the invincible vague hope of youth and the irrepressible consciousness of power were almost ready to flame up afresh, contrary to all reasons, and irradiate her starless soul. End of Book 6, Chapter 6. End of Hilda Lessways by Arnold BENNETT.